I was not a sentimental man. Anyone who had served under me at the siege of Corvenmore could have told you that. Any officer who had ridden at my flank through 2 winters of the Northern Campaign, or who had watched me order the burning of a bridge while our own wounded were still crossing it, a necessary cruelty, one the generals praised in their dispatches, could have told you the same. I was the War Duke of Varnholt. I had earned that name in fire and cannon smoke, not at a garden party. I had earned it by making the decisions that softer men wept over in their tents, and I had never once lost sleep over it. That was what I told myself. It was what I continued to tell myself on the morning of the 14th of October, in the 37th year of my life, when my brother Edmund dragged me, against every instinct I possessed, to Hallerton House for what society was pleased to call a marriage exhibition. You will perhaps know the institution. You may have heard it described in the drawing rooms of London as a kind of refined arrangement, a civilized meeting of eligible ladies and their potential suitors, conducted under the watchful eye of society's most powerful matrons. This is a very polite name for what it truly was. It was a market. The women were arranged like goods on display. The men walked through and made their selections. The difference between Hallerton House and the dockside markets I had seen in my campaigning years was principally one of upholstery. I said as much to Edmund as our carriage rolled up the gravel drive. He gave me the look he had been giving me since childhood, the one that communicated without a word that he was aware I was impossible, that he had long since made his peace with this fact, and that he intended to ignore me regardless. "You need a wife," he said. "I need a cup of coffee and to be left alone. You need an heir. Father's solicitors have written again. If you die without one, the estate passes to cousin Aldrich." I considered this for a moment. Aldrich was a man who had once, at a hunt breakfast, described the correct management of a foxhound as fundamentally similar to the correct management of a tenant farmer. He had meant it as wisdom. "Fine," I said, "I will look." Edmund smiled. I should not have trusted that smile. My brother had been smiling at me that way since I was 9 years old and he was 7, and it had never once preceded a good outcome. Hallerton House was enormous, yellow-stoned, and relentlessly cheerful in the autumn light. The great doors stood open. Footmen in blue livery stood at attention on either side. Carriages were disgorging their contents in orderly succession. Men in tailcoats, women in their finest, matrons in pearls and lace, and the particular expression of determined assessment that distinguished them from their more ornamental companions. Inside, the principal rooms had been thrown open and connected, creating one long sweep of gleaming floors and candlelit alcoves, populated by perhaps 40 young women arranged in careful groupings. Some stood near their mothers. Some sat at instruments. Some were posed near flower arrangements of such extravagant size that I wondered if the flowers were meant to conceal them or to make them appear to emerge, goddess-like, from a bower of rose and lily. Beside each woman, or near her, was a small printed card on a silver tray. I took one up. It listed her name, her family, her accomplishments, and here I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air, a figure. A figure in pounds sterling. Not a dowry, not an annual income. A figure representing the sum required to satisfy the debts attached to her father's estate and secure her hand. I was a man who had stood in burning citadels without flinching. In that moment, reading that card, I felt something very close to revulsion. "Edmund," I said. Yes, he was already scanning the room with the cheerful efficiency of a man who had arrived prepared. "These women are being sold." That is an uncharitable way of framing what is essentially. "They are being sold," I said again, and I set the card down on the tray with a care that cost me some effort. "And we are here to buy one." Edmund had the grace to look uncomfortable, only for a moment. "The alternative," he said, "is that their families drown entirely in debt and the women end in worse situations. Lord Hallerton at least ensures they go to respectable homes." Respectable, I tasted the word, found it insufficient. "Marcus," he used my given name. He rarely did that outside of genuine urgency. "I know what you think of this. I think the same of it, but you are here and some of these women would benefit from a man like you. A man who is decent, even if he pretends otherwise. A man whose estate is not encumbered by debt, who would give a woman security and not cruelty." He paused. "Consider that before you put your nose in the air and get back in the carriage." I did not get back in the carriage. I walked the room instead, because Edmund was not wrong and I was not fool enough to pretend otherwise. I looked at the assembled women with the same attention I gave to tactical maps, trying to see not the surface but what lay beneath it. The woman near the window, very beautiful, very aware of it, who caught my eye and held it with practiced precision. The woman at the pianoforte, who played well but who glanced repeatedly at the door with an expression that told me she was waiting for someone who was not going to arrive. The woman seated near her mother, rigid with a composure so perfect it had the quality of armor. I was not drawn to any of them. Not unkindly. They were daughters of unlucky men, mostly, wearing their difficulty bravely. I bore them no ill will. I simply felt nothing that resembled the pull I had been told, in the romances my mother used to read beside the fire, that a man was supposed to feel. I had nearly completed my circuit of the room, had nearly decided that Edmund's plan was a failure, that I would endure another letter from the solicitors and another season of Cousin Aldrich's menacing proximity, when I turned a corner near the back of the second room and stopped. She was not displayed. That was the first thing I noticed. Every other woman in Hallerton House was arranged. This woman was simply sitting on a plain wooden chair at the far end of the room, slightly apart from the nearest grouping, with a small silver tray on the table beside her and a card on it that no one appeared to have picked up. She wore a gown of pale gray wool, not a ball gown, not a presentation gown, but a plain, good gown, the kind worn by women of limited means who took care of what they had. Her hair was dark and simply dressed, no elaborate curls or constructed arrangement, just pinned neatly at the back of her head with a few strands escaped at her temples. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was not playing an instrument. She was not exhibiting an accomplishment. She was reading. In the middle of a marriage exhibition, with 40 other women arranged to their best advantage and a room full of assessing eyes, this woman was reading a small leather-bound book, held just below the line of her folded hands, as if she had decided that if she must be here, she would at least use the time productively. I felt something move in my chest that I did not immediately recognize. I walked toward her. She did not look up until I was 3 feet away, and even then the look she gave me was brief and, I thought, slightly inconvenienced. As though I had interrupted a passage, she was following with attention. "Good morning," I said. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was quiet and clear. She did not put the book down. I looked at the card on the silver tray. The name written on it was Miss Cecily Marne. Below that, a figure, £1,040, and below that, in smaller printing, debt attaching to the estate of Sir Oswald Marne, deceased. Payment clears all encumbrance and releases the above-named for lawful marriage. I read that twice. "Miss Marne," I said. Yes, she had still not put the book down, though I thought I saw her mark her place with one finger. "You are reading at a marriage exhibition." "I am aware of that." "Is the book interesting?" She considered the question with a seriousness I found disarming. "It is a treatise on the management of drainage systems on agricultural estates," she said. "I found it on a shelf in the library as I came through. It is more interesting than standing near the flowers." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Do you have an opinion on tile drainage versus open-channel systems?" She looked up at me fully then for the first time. Her eyes were a shade of amber brown that I found, somewhat to my surprise, extremely difficult to look away from. They held an expression I could only describe as cautious assessment, the look of a person who had learned not to trust easy interest. "Tile drainage," she said. "If the soil is clay-heavy, open channels silt too quickly. I have 300 acres of clay-heavy pasture on the western boundary of my estate," I said. "My steward has been arguing with me about it for 2 years." "Your steward is probably right," she said. I nearly laughed. I hadn't laughed, genuinely, without performance, in longer than I could accurately remember. Instead I said, "May I sit?" She looked at the empty chair beside her for a moment, then at me, with an expression that suggested she was performing a calculation. Then she said, "Yes," and moved her book slightly to one side, and I sat down beside Miss Cecily Marne, and we talked about agricultural drainage for 20 minutes, which was, I could say with certainty, the most enjoyable 20 minutes I had spent at a social event in a decade. I found out in the course of those 20 minutes and the 20 that followed, the following things about her. She was 23 years old. Her father, Sir Oswald Marne, had died 8 months previously, leaving behind him a tangle of investments gone bad, a mortgaged house, and debts that had consumed everything else. Her mother had died 3 years before that, of a fever that had taken most of the household in a week. She had one younger brother, James, 14 years old, currently at a school that was threatening to put him out at the end of term if the fees were not paid. She had sold what could be sold, her mother's jewelry, most of the library, the better pieces of furniture, and had come to Hallerton House because Lord Hallerton's arrangement was, as she put it with a very precise flatness, the most straightforward of the available options. "You don't want to be here," I said. "I don't particularly want to be anywhere at present," she said. "But that is a feeling, not a fact. The fact is that my brother needs his school fees paid, and I need somewhere to live that is not the street." "Would you not prefer a kinder fiction?" I asked. "Most of the women here have found one." She looked at me with those amber-brown eyes and said, "Would you prefer me to have one?" I said honestly, no. She nodded as if this were a reasonable thing to say, and looked back at her book. I stayed. It occurred to me that I should perhaps survey the rest of the room, perform due diligence, make a sensible assessment of all available options. I did not do any of those things. I sat beside Miss Cecily Marne and we talked about her father's estate, about drainage, about a book she had read on the reform of poor relief, about the management of tenant cottages, about James's interest in engineering, and whether the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich might suit a clever boy of 14. She spoke precisely and without flourish, and she was right about more things than she was wrong about, which put her above most of the generals I had ever served with. Edmund found me an hour later. He appeared at my elbow with the expression of a man who has been searching a large house and is experiencing a complicated mixture of relief and bafflement. "There you are," he said. He stopped. He looked at Miss Marne, then at me, then at the card on the silver tray, then back at me. Something shifted in his face. "Ah," he said. "Edmund," I said, "would you be so good as to find Lord Hallerton for me?" Edmund looked at Miss Marne. She was watching him with polite reserve. He looked back at me. That smile appeared, the one I had never trusted, and he said, "I'll find him directly." He walked away rather quickly. I thought I saw his shoulders shaking. Miss Marne said without inflection, "You're going to pay the amount on the card." "I'm going to pay twice the amount on the card." A silence, then why twice? "Because I want your brother's school fees covered for the next 4 years, I said. "And because I suspect that the figure on the card reflects a calculation of what the market will bear rather than what is actually owed, and I would rather overpay than leave any ambiguity." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "You don't know me. I know that you have good sense about drainage systems and poor relief and the education of clever boys," I said. "I know that you came to a room full of people performing elaborate fictions and chose to read a book about agriculture instead. I know that when I offered you a kinder story, you declined it." I paused. "That seems like a sufficient beginning." "A beginning," she repeated. The word seemed to sit between us with weight. "Not an ending." "No," I said, "not an ending." She looked at the card on the silver tray for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "I would prefer that to the alternative." "I don't know if I can, if I will," she stopped, started again. "I am not in a position to refuse. I want you to understand that. The situation I am in does not leave me a great deal of room. If I were to decline what you are offering, I would be in a worse position, not a better one, and so what you might interpret as acceptance is also, in part, the absence of any real choice. I think you should know that." I thought about that. I thought about it carefully because she deserved to be thought about carefully. "Then here is what I propose," I said. "I pay the figure on that card today. Your debts are cleared. Your brother's school is secured. You come to Varnholt House as my guest, not as my property. You have rooms of your own. You have a household allowance. If after 3 months you find that we do not suit one another, I will arrange a settlement that leaves you with your own income and a small house, and you will not be worse than you are now." I met her eyes. "You will have a choice. I am offering you one today." She was very still. "And if after 3 months," she said slowly, "I find that we might suit." "Then we will talk about it," I said, "as equals." Another silence. She looked at the book in her hands. She looked at the card on the silver tray. She looked at the room full of women and men, the calculations and the arrangements and the polite performances going on around us. Then she said, "All right then." And that was how I came to pay £2,080 to Lord Hallerton on a Tuesday morning in October, in the 37th year of my life, with my brother Edmund standing at a discreet distance, making no effort whatsoever to conceal his delight. I should tell you what happened in the hall. I have described it in the years since as a small incident. Edmund, who was there, has taken some pleasure in describing it otherwise. The truth is probably closer to his account than to mine, but I am the one telling the story, and I am telling it as I experienced it. What happened was this. We were coming down the main staircase, the three of us, Lord Hallerton, myself, and Edmund, having completed the business in Hallerton's study. Miss Marne had been waiting in the entrance hall, standing very still and straight with her small traveling bag at her feet and her book under her arm, looking at nothing in particular with a composure that I was already beginning to recognize as a kind of armor she wore when she was not entirely sure of the ground she stood on. In the entrance hall, also waiting, was a man I recognized after a moment as Sir Reginald Pask, a baronet of middling fortune and large opinion, who had been a recurring presence at my clubs for some years, and who had cultivated a particular manner that he seemed to believe projected authority, and in fact projected a kind of grasping anxiety that I found unpleasant. He was looking at Miss Marne. He looked at her the way the men at Hallerton House had looked at the cards beside the women, with a calculating assessment that took in her plain gown and her traveling bag and the absence of any visible family support, and arrived at a conclusion that I could read clearly from where I stood. "Miss Marne," Pask said as we came down the stairs. He had not noticed me yet or had decided to proceed regardless. "I was just coming to find Hallerton about your card. I believe I'm prepared to make an offer." Miss Marne looked at him with the same polite, measuring reserve she had turned on Edmund. "Lord Hallerton has completed his business for the morning," she said. Pask glanced at Hallerton. "Completed? I've been waiting for half an hour." "I was here before." He saw me then, halfway down the stairs, and stopped. I came the rest of the way down at my usual pace, which I was told, by people who observed it, communicated a certain finality of intention. "Pask," I said. "Varnholt," he recovered quickly, but not as quickly as he thought. "I wasn't aware you were." I understood Miss Marne was still. "Miss Marne's situation has been resolved," I said. "She will be coming to Varnholt House." A beat, Pask was doing a calculation, and I could see it happening, the rapid assessment of whether it was worth saying what he was clearly thinking. He decided it was. "She has no family standing," he said, with the tone of a man offering a helpful observation. "Her father was in debt to half the county. A woman in her position, with a ward to support. You'd do better to look at the Hensley girl, or Lady Constance Furringcall, who has." "Miss Marne," I said, "has better judgment about agricultural drainage than anyone I've spoken to in 3 years, and more honesty than everyone in this hall combined." I picked up her traveling bag from the floor beside her. "Shall we go?" She looked at me, then she looked at Pask, whose face had gone through several interesting colors. "Yes," she said. "I think we shall." We walked out of Hallerton House into the autumn morning, Edmund at our heels doing very poorly at concealing his expression, and Miss Cecily Marne of the plain gray gown and the book on drainage systems got into my carriage, and we drove away from Hallerton House, and I did not look back. Varnholt House was 3 hours by road from London, in the southern corner of Dorsetshire, on an estate that had belonged to my family for 200 years. It was a large house by most measures, though not the largest in the county, stone-built, with a long south front and a park that ran down to a chalk stream, and the 300 acres of clay-heavy pasture I had mentioned to Miss Marne, which my steward Harwick had been pressing me to drain for the better part of 3 years. She looked out the carriage window as we came through the gates, taking it in with the same quiet assessment she seemed to bring to everything. "It's a working estate," she said. It was not quite a question. "Primarily," I said. "There is a home farm, the park supports sheep in summer. There is a chalk stream with good trout fishing if you fish." "I don't," she said, "but I'd like to walk the western boundary." "The clay-heavy pasture." "Yes." I looked at her. "Tomorrow morning," I said, "if the weather holds." She nodded as if this were a satisfactory arrangement, and went back to looking out the window. Mrs. Harwick, my housekeeper, was waiting at the front steps when we arrived. She was a compact and decisive woman of 50 who had managed Varnholt House for 15 years with the combination of iron routine and personal warmth that I had come to understand was the only approach that actually worked in a large household. She had been informed by letter that I was returning with a guest. She had not been informed of the circumstances, and I watched her take them in, the plain gown, the small bag, the absence of a maid or companion, and adjust without so much as a flicker. "Miss Marne," she said, "welcome to Varnholt House. I hope your journey was comfortable. I've put you in the east wing, which gets the morning light. If that doesn't suit, we'll move you tomorrow. There's a sitting room that connects, and I've had a fire laid as the evenings are cold." Miss Marne looked at her for a moment with an expression I was beginning to be able to read. The slight softening that meant she was encountering something she hadn't expected to be kind. "Thank you," she said. "That sounds very comfortable." "Dinner is at 7, said Mrs. Harwick. "His Grace keeps country hours. I've had tea sent to your sitting room in case you'd like to rest first." "I wouldn't," said Miss Marne, "but I would like to see the house if someone has time to show me." Mrs. Harwick looked at me with an expression that I could not quite interpret and then said, "I'll do it myself if His Grace can spare me." "By all means," I said. I watched them go, the housekeeper and the woman in the gray gown, walking through the doors of my house together, and I stood on the front steps for a moment in the October light and thought about the day I had just had and felt something I couldn't entirely name. Edmund, who had ridden alongside the carriage on horseback, for reasons he claimed had to do with the weather, appeared at my elbow. "Well," he said. "Don't," I said. "I haven't said anything." "You were about to." "I was going to say she seems remarkable," he said. "That's all. Remarkable, and not in the least what you would have chosen if you had been thinking in the ordinary way." He paused, "which suggests to me that for once in your life you were not thinking in the ordinary way. And I find that a very encouraging sign." I went inside before he could say anything else. The 3 months I had promised her passed differently than any 3 months I could recall. That is not quite the right way to say it. Let me try again. In the 37 years before the morning I walked into Hallerton House, I had grown accustomed to time passing in a certain way. The military years had given time a particular texture, dense, compressed, the weeks indistinguishable from each other except by the positions of armies. The years since my return from the campaign had been different but no easier. The management of the estate, the management of the solicitors, the management of Edmund's various concerns, the management of my own considerable capacity for brooding, which I had always known was there but had never found a satisfying outlet for. What those months at Varnholt House gave me, I did not know how to name until much later. I will tell you what happened in them. On the second morning, as I had promised, we walked the western boundary. Harwick came with us because there were practical questions about the drainage work that required his input, and I watched Miss Marne walk the edge of the clay pasture and ask Harwick questions with a precision and knowledge that clearly surprised him, and which I watched him revise his estimate of her with at some speed. "She's read more on the subject than you have, sir," he told me afterward, in the tone of a man reporting an intelligence assessment. "I know," I said. She suggested a herringbone pattern for the tile runs. I'd been arguing for parallel lines. "What did you conclude?" "She's right," he said, with the air of a man making a painful but necessary admission. "The herringbone will drain faster." A pause. She also noticed that the bank by the east channel needs repointing before winter, which I'd missed. "Harwick," I said, "would you be willing to consult with Miss Marne about the drainage plan before we finalize it?" He looked at me with the expression of a man trying to work out if this was some kind of test. Then he said, "Willingly, sir. She knows what she's talking about." This was, from Harwick, the highest praise he was capable of bestowing. The drainage project became a common thread between us in those weeks. She would come out in the mornings, in a plain dark coat and boots that I suspected had been resoled once already, and walk the fields with Harwick or with me, and talk about water table and soil composition and the relative merits of different drainage tile materials with an attention and competence that I found, each time, unexpectedly moving. Not because it was unusual, though it was, but because she did it without any apparent awareness that it might impress anyone, without performance or display. She simply cared about the problem and brought her mind to bear on it, and spoke clearly about what she thought. In the evenings, she read in the library, which she had examined with the thoroughness of a scholar and the delight of a woman who had recently been obliged to sell her own. I had a good library, my mother's doing, principally. She had been a reader and had spent freely on books, and Miss Marne went through it systematically, not by whim but with a clear intention that I eventually identified as the pursuit of several specific subjects. Agricultural management, the history of estate law, a translation she was working through of a French agricultural journal that she had found on the bottom shelf. She spoke to me about what she read at dinner in the evenings. She had not been shy exactly in those first days, but she had been careful, measuring each step before she placed it. As the weeks passed, the carefulness softened somewhat, not into ease exactly, but into a kind of growing assurance. She began to say what she thought without the pause before it. She began to disagree with me about things that mattered, and to hold the disagreement steadily when I pushed back, and to revise her position only when she had genuinely been convinced, not when I was simply louder than she was. I found this extraordinary. I had not been disagreed with in my own house in a very long time. My household ran smoothly, efficiently, and largely in the direction I indicated. Miss Marne ran in the direction she had determined upon after her own assessment, and she explained her reasons clearly and then waited for mine, and we went back and forth in a way that I realized, after the first few weeks, was what I had always believed conversation was meant to be and had stopped expecting to find. James came at the half-term holiday. I had not been entirely sure what to expect from a 14-year-old boy whose sister had been sold, however politely, into an arrangement with a stranger. I had expected wariness at minimum and possibly hostility, and had prepared for this by asking Edmund to be present as a buffer, which Edmund agreed to with suspicious willingness. James Marne was a slight boy, dark-haired like his sister, with her same amber eyes and a quality of alert attention that I recognized as a family trait. He arrived by coach with a trunk that was heavy with books, which I took as a promising sign. He shook my hand with the formal gravity of a boy who had been practicing the manners of a man, and then he looked around the hall of Varnholt House with an expression of carefully controlled awe that he was not quite managing to conceal. "It's a large house," he said, in the tone of someone making an observation they have decided is safe. "It is," I agreed. "I'll have someone show you the west wing tomorrow. There's a clock in the gallery that predates the house by 100 years, some question about where it came from, if you're interested in mechanisms." He looked at me sharply. "I am," he said. "Harwick will know the history of it better than I do. Talk to him." James nodded, filed this away, and went to find his sister. I watched him cross the hall. Edmund materialized at my elbow. "He'll be fine," he said. "I know," I said. "You're nervous," Edmund said. "I'm not nervous," I said. "I'm assessing." "You're nervous," Edmund said, with the serenity of a man who had spent 35 years watching me and knew exactly what he was looking at. James was fine. He was more than fine. He spent the first afternoon with Harwick examining the clock in the gallery, emerging at dinner with a theory about its origin and 3 pages of notes. He spent the following morning with Miss Marne walking the estate, and the afternoon in the library, and the second evening attempting to teach me a card game that I suspected he had invented most of the rules for as he went, and which I played badly on purpose because I found his attempts to explain it to me, with barely contained laughter, to be one of the finer things I had experienced in recent memory. After he left to return to school on the Monday coach, Miss Marne stood in the entrance hall for a moment after the carriage disappeared down the drive. I stood beside her. "He's happy there," she said. "At the school he wasn't at first, but he's found people, he's found a purpose. He's a clever boy." Yes, a pause. He was very nervous about coming here. He'd heard things about you. I looked at her. "What things?" She met my eyes. "That you are the most feared man in 3 counties, that you burned a bridge during the campaign with your own troops still on it, that you broke a man's arm at your club last year for cheating at cards." "I broke his wrist," I said, "and he had taken £400 from a boy of 19 who'd just come into his money." A silence, then she said, "He told me last night that he thinks you might be all right, actually." "High praise." "From James it is," she said. And she looked at me with those amber-brown eyes, and there was something in that look that was different from the careful measurement of the early days, something warmer and more complicated. and that I did not know how to respond to except to feel it move through me like the first warmth after a long winter. I need to tell you about the night of the November storm, because it matters, and because it was the first time I understood how completely wrong I had been about a number of things I had thought I understood. The storm came in on a Thursday evening in late November, when the first real cold of winter was already in the ground. I had been expecting it. The barometer had been falling since morning, and Harwick had taken the precaution of checking the roof timbers over the east wing, which had been giving some trouble since the spring. What none of us had anticipated was that the trouble was worse than the inspection had suggested, and that the particular angle at which the storm hit would send water in along the east gable in a way that found every gap in the old lead work. I was in my study at 10 o'clock when Harwick appeared at the door with the expression of a man delivering military intelligence. "East wing is taking water, sir," he said. "The ceiling in the blue bedroom has come in." "Anyone in it?" "Miss Marne, sir. She's moved to the corridor. She's all right. But the room's in a bad way." I went immediately, through the connecting corridor and into the east wing, and found Miss Marne standing in the passage outside the blue bedroom in her dressing gown, holding a branch candlestick and looking through the open door with an expression of pragmatic assessment. The ceiling had come down in a section roughly 6 feet square, and water was still coming through in a steady sheet, and plaster was on the floor and the bed both. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "No," she said. "I heard it start to crack and got out before it came down. I've put a pail under the worst of it." She looked through the door. "The roof over that section has been going for some time, I think. Harwick must have missed it on the inspection." "He knows," I said. "He's already up there." She nodded, still looking at the ceiling. Then she looked at me. "I need somewhere to sleep," she said, with a matter-of-factness that somehow made me like her more than I had yet. "There are 4 other bedrooms in the east wing," I said. "2 of them have the same roof section," she said. "I had a look on my way to find you." "The green room in the south passage," I said. "It's warmer anyway." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I was coming to find you," she said. "To tell me about the ceiling." "Yes," she said, and because she started again more quietly. "Because it was loud and the ceiling came down and it was dark for a moment before I found the candle, and I wanted," another pause. "I wanted to find you." I stood in the passage in the November storm, with water coming through the ceiling of the east wing and candlelight moving in the draught, and looked at Cecily Marne. "Come," I said, "I'll take you to the green room." She did not say anything else, but she walked beside me through the passage, and at one point where the corridor turned and the candle threw a long shadow, her hand found my arm, not grasping, not frightened, just there, a quiet presence. And I did not say anything either. I simply walked beside her and did not move my arm away. In the green room, I made sure the fire was lit, and the curtains drawn against the draught, and that there were extra blankets, all of the things that a man who has spent years managing soldiers in bad weather knows to think of. She stood in the middle of the room with her candlestick and watched me do all of this, and when I had finished, she said, "You're very competent in an emergency." "It's a useful quality," I said. "Yes," she said, "it is," a pause, "thank you." "The ceiling will be fixed by the end of the week," I said. "Harwick will have men on it by morning." "I know," she said. "That's not what I'm thanking you for." I looked at her. The candlelight was warm, and the fire was beginning to catch, and she was standing there in her dressing gown with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and there was something in that moment that was so simple and so clear that it frightened me slightly, which was not something I was accustomed to. "Good night, Miss Marne," I said. "Good night," she said, and then very quietly, "Marcus." She had never called me that before. I had not asked her to. It was, in the year of our acquaintance, the first time she used my given name. I walked back along the passage to my own rooms, and I sat in the chair by my fire, and I thought for a long time about the particular quality of my own feelings, which were clear and warm and large, and which I now understood, keeping carefully at a certain distance for the better part of 3 months. The 3 months I had promised her elapsed on the 14th of January. She was in the library when I found her, as she frequently was in the mornings, with the French Agricultural Journal open on the table before her and notes on a separate sheet. She looked up when I came in, and I thought I saw, for just a moment, something in her face that she quickly composed into her usual steadiness. I sat down across the table from her. 3 months, I said. Yes, she said. I know. I said we would talk about it. Yes, she looked down at the journal, then up at me. You said we would talk about it as equals. I did, I said, and I meant it, so I want to ask you clearly what you want, not what the situation leaves you room for, what you actually want. She was quiet for a moment. I want to be honest with you, she said. I told you that at the beginning. You did. I came here in October and I did not know what you were. I knew the name and the reputation and the figure on the card, and I came here because there was no better alternative, and I thought, she paused. I thought I would manage whatever it was. I am good at managing things. You are, I agreed. But it has not been what I expected. She met my eyes. You talked to me, not at me, not around me. You asked me what I thought and then you listened to the answer and it changed what you did. You gave James a clock to puzzle over and you played his invented card game badly on purpose because it made him laugh. You gave me a room and a household allowance and you told me I had a choice, and then you made sure the choice was real. She paused. I had not expected any of that. I had not expected you, I said. She looked at me. I want you to stay, I said. Not as my guest, not as an arrangement that can be dissolved after 6 months. I want you to stay because I have been talking to you across this table for 3 months and I have found you to be the most. I stopped. I was not, as Edmund would have told you, a man given to eloquent declarations. To be what I didn't know I was looking for, I finished, which was plainly spoken and entirely true. She was very still for a long moment. Then she said, the drainage project will be finished by March. Yes, I said, not entirely sure where she was going. And after that, I thought the east boundary wall needed attention. And the home farm buildings have at least 3 outbuildings that want repair before spring. And James's summer term fees will be due in April. She paused. I have been thinking about what comes next, on the estate, what needs doing. And I said, and I find that I have been thinking of it as mine, she said very quietly, as something I am part of. I have been thinking about the spring planting and the summer shearing and the east wall and what comes next as things I am going to do, not things that might happen if I stay. She looked at her hands. I didn't decide to feel that way, it just became true. Then stay, I said. She looked up at me. I will, she said, not because I have to, because I want to. I want to tell you about the moment that will always be, to me, the truest summary of what I had found. It was in February, on a cold, bright morning when the chalk stream had a thin skin of ice along the shallow margins and the clay pasture, our clay pasture, which Harwick and Miss Marne had now drained to their joint satisfaction. The herringbone tile runs laid, and the water, moving properly through to the field ditch, lay quiet under the winter sun. We were walking the boundary together, as we had done many times, but something had shifted in the walk itself, in the way we moved alongside each other. I had offered her my arm at the gate, which I had not done before, and she had taken it, which told me something. We walked in silence for a while, because silence between us had never been uncomfortable. It was one of the things I had first noticed about her, that she was not a woman who felt the need to fill every quiet with words. At the far corner of the field, where the boundary hedge met the old stone wall, and the view opened out to the south, she stopped and looked out over the winter-quiet estate. I wrote to James yesterday, she said. How is he? He has a friend now, a boy named Petworth who is also interested in mechanisms. They are apparently attempting to build a working model of a water mill in the school carpentry room. She paused. He also asked me when you were going to take him fishing. I told him I didn't fish. He knows, he thinks you should learn. Another pause. He thinks very well of you, Marcus. I looked out over the pasture. The ice on the stream caught the winter light and threw it back in small, bright fragments. Miss Marne, I said. Cecily, she said quietly. Cecily. It was the first time I had used her given name, and I felt the rightness of it in a way that was difficult to describe. I should like to be your husband, not as an arrangement and not as a transaction. I should like to be your husband because you are the most honest and most competent and the most real person I have met in a very long time, and because you called me Marcus in the middle of the night during a storm, and I have not been the same since. She looked at me, and this time there was nothing held back in the look, none of the careful measurement of the early days, none of the armor. just Cecily Marne looking at me in the winter light. "Yes," she said. "Yes," I repeated. "Yes," she said again, more firmly, as if she were settling something. "Now take me back inside, it's extremely cold, and I want to talk to you about the east wall before Harwick submits his report." I laughed, genuinely, without performance, the way I had nearly laughed the first morning at Hallerton House when she told me my steward was probably right. "As you wish," I said. She took my arm again as we turned back toward the house, and we walked across the winter estate in the cold, bright morning, and I felt, with a certainty that I have never since had occasion to revise, that the 37 years before this one had been prologue. We were married in March, on a bright, clear day with the first suggestion of spring in the air, in the old church at the edge of the Varnholt estate, which had been the family's church for 200 years, and which smelled of cold stone and candle wax and the particular silence of places that have held many things. Edmund was there, beaming. Harwick was there in his Sunday coat, looking as if he were reviewing the ceremony for organizational deficiencies. James was there, on half-term again, taller than he had been at Christmas, wearing a suit that was slightly too big for him and a look of concentrated seriousness that dissolved into an unguarded grin the moment the vicar pronounced us married. Cecily wore a gown of pale blue wool, not the plain gray of Hallerton House, but a finer thing made by the Varnholt village dressmaker, simple and well cut, and exactly what she would have chosen for herself, which I knew because she had chosen it herself, in the same way she chose everything, with clear consideration and without performance. She walked to the altar on James's arm, because she had no other family and James was the family that was hers, and she walked steadily and with her chin level and her eyes on mine, and I stood and watched her come toward me and felt something large and quiet settle in my chest, the way a house settles into its foundations after a storm. After the ceremony, when the vicar had said his words and signed his register, and we had stepped out into the March sunlight with the small gathering of our people behind us, I heard Lord Hallerton, who had been invited because Edmund had decided this was appropriate, over my mild objections, say something to his companion that I only partly heard, something about circumstances and arrangements, and it turning out well enough. I did not turn around. Cecily's hand was on my arm and James was already arguing with Edmund about something, and Harwick was examining the churchyard wall with the eye of a man identifying structural concerns, and the March sun was warm on my face. I was not a sentimental man, but I knew, in that moment, that I had done the best thing I had ever done in my life, and that it had begun not with strategy or reason or the careful assessment of a tactical map, but with a woman reading about drainage systems in a chair at the far end of a room, and the entirely irrational decision to sit down beside her. I have been asked in the years since what made me so certain, what it was, in that first hour at Hallerton House, that led me to a decision as certain as any I had made in a campaign. I never know quite how to answer that question, because the honest answer is not the dramatic one. It was not her beauty, though she was, in the way I have always found most compelling, beautiful, not the decorated, displayed beauty of the women who spent their evenings being seen, but the beauty of a face that was entirely itself, unperformed, real in every line. It was not her practicality, though that was part of it, and it was not her knowledge of drainage systems, though that was part of it too. It was this. She told me the truth about herself in that first hour when she had no reason to and some reason not to. She told me that she had no real choice and that I should know it. She told me that what I might take for acceptance was also, in part, necessity. She told me this when a kinder fiction would have served her better in the short term, and she told me because she had decided that honesty was what she was, regardless of whether it was useful. I had spent most of my life in the company of men and women who said what served them. I had been in rooms full of negotiation my whole life, the barely concealed negotiation of society as much as the explicit negotiation of military and political life, and I was very tired of it. Here was a woman who would not do that, not even when it cost her. That was what I knew in the first hour, and it was enough. The estate in the years that followed became something different from what it had been. Not dramatically, not in the way of storybooks, where a new wife arrives and the house is transformed overnight. Gradually, practically, the way good work is done. The western pasture drainage was finished to Harwick's and Cecily's joint satisfaction by the end of that first winter, and by the following summer the pasture was carrying twice the stock it had the year before, which pleased Harwick in the way that a well-solved problem always pleased him, and which pleased Cecily in the way that any useful thing done well pleased her, and which pleased me because it pleased them both. The east wall was repaired in the spring of the second year. The home farm outbuildings were addressed in the third. The school fees were paid, and James finished his schooling and went up to study engineering, and came home in the holidays and grew taller each time, and brought his friend Petworth on 2 occasions, and Petworth turned out to be a quiet, serious young man with a gift for mathematics who spent most of his visit in the library, which Cecily considered a point in his favor. Edmund visited regularly. He had, in the way of the best kind of brothers, made a quiet project of being fond of Cecily without making a performance of it, and she had made a quiet project of being fond of him in return, and over the years this had grown into something genuine and unceremonious that I valued more than I said. There were society events, because there always are, and some of them were more pleasant than others. I had never been a comfortable man in the rooms of the great and glittering, and I remained uncomfortable in them. But I was less lonely in them than I had been, because Cecily was there, and because she had the gift of finding, in any room, the one interesting person, and talking to them, and introducing me, and afterwards telling me what she had learned in that flat, clear way that made even a tedious evening yield something worth knowing. I want to tell you about the evening at Harwood Park. It was in our 3rd year of marriage, at the autumn gathering that the Harwood family hosted each October. A large party, 60 or 70 guests. The kind of event that Cecily accepted because it was useful and I attended because she accepted it. Lady Harwood was a sharp, clever woman of 60 who had been, as I understood it, a kind of power in the county for the better part of 3 decades, and who had an accurate eye for people and a long memory for slights. She had met Cecily at 2 previous occasions, and I had not been present for either, but I had been given reports, by Edmund, who found all of this entertaining, that she had been cool on the first occasion and considerably warmer on the second, and that she had, by the time of the Harwood Park autumn party, arrived at a position that Edmund described as cautious approval. We arrived late because the road had been muddy and the coachman had taken a detour. The rooms were already full when we came in, which meant that our entry was more observed than I would have chosen. I was used to being observed. The War Duke of Varnholt was always going to be the largest person in any room's awareness, if not always the largest in the room, and Cecily had grown, over 3 years, from careful composure into a kind of easy steadiness that I found, each time I noticed it, quietly remarkable. She was in dark green, which suited her. She wore my mother's pearls, which she wore occasionally, and which always moved me slightly in a way I had decided not to examine too closely. We were met almost immediately by Lady Harwood, who was moving through her guests with the practiced ease of a woman who had been doing this for 40 years. "Varnholt," she said, and then to Cecily, "My dear, you look very well. I want to introduce you to Lady Fenwick before you lose me to the crowd. She has the most interesting scheme for the improvement of cottager education, and I think you would have a great deal to say to each other." Cecily looked at me, and I made the slight gesture that meant go, "I will find you," and she went with Lady Harwood, and I stood for a moment in the entrance of the room and watched her cross it, watched her stop and speak to someone she recognized, and laugh at something said to her, and move through the crowd with the ease of a woman who had found, in the 3 years since Hallerton House, that she could occupy a room as herself without either shrinking or performing. I felt, watching her, the particular warmth I had grown accustomed to feeling in such moments. Large, steady, the temperature of a well-banked fire rather than a quick flame. Pask was there. I had not seen him since Hallerton House, which was 3 years past, and he had changed only in the way that men of his type change when things have not gone as they wished, a slight hardening around the eyes, a slight tightening in the way he held himself. He came toward me with the confidence of a man who has decided to let the past be the past, which I recognized as the social maneuver it was and addressed accordingly, which is to say I looked at him without warmth and waited to see what he intended. "Varnholt," he said, "it's been some years." "It has," I agreed. "I heard the estate is doing well. The western pasture, particularly. Harwick is very free with his opinions on drainage tile at the market." "The estate is well," I said. A pause. He looked across the room, where Cecily was now deep in conversation with 2 women near the window, Lady Fenwick, I assumed, and one other. From where I stood, I could see her talking with the focused energy she brought to a subject she cared about, her hands moving slightly as she made a point. "Your wife has done well for herself," Pask said, with a tone that he probably meant as generous, and that landed slightly wrong. "Considering." "She has done well," I agreed, "in the same way that any person of real intelligence and real character does well when they are given room to work. Which is to say, not by luck, but by being exactly who they are." Pask was quiet for a moment. "Varnholt," he said, "I wasn't suggesting." "I know what you weren't suggesting," I said pleasantly. "And I know what you were. But as the point is moot after 3 years, and as this is Harwood's party and not a place for old arguments, perhaps we should leave it there." He agreed, and I was not unpleasant to him for the rest of the evening, because there was no profit in it. But I moved toward Cecily and her companions at the window, and when I came into her orbit she turned, and her face did the thing I had first seen in February. On the morning we walked the winter boundary, opened, simply, into the warmth she kept for people she trusted, and she drew me into the conversation with Lady Fenwick as if it were the most natural thing in the world, which by that point it was. In the carriage home she leaned her head against my arm and was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Lady Fenwick has the most coherent plan for cottage education I've ever heard. I want to talk to you about it." "Tomorrow," I said. "Tell me tomorrow." She was quiet again. Then Pask was there. "I saw him." "Did he say anything?" "Nothing of consequence." She turned her head slightly and looked up at me in the dark of the carriage. I could not see her face clearly, but I could feel her looking. "Marcus," she said. "Yes." "I know that you are protective of me. I want you to know that I don't need." "I know you don't need it," I said. "I wasn't protecting you from anything. I was simply not interested in letting a man speak about my wife with the tone of a man extending charity, when what she has and what she is has nothing to do with charity and everything to do with who she is." A pause. "That's not protection, that's just accuracy." A silence. Then she laughed quietly in the dark carriage with her head against my arm. "All right," she said. "Accuracy, fine." We went home to Varnholt House in the October dark, and I helped her down from the carriage in the lamplight of the front steps, and Mrs. Harwick had left tea, and we sat by the fire in the drawing room, and Cecily told me about Lady Fenwick's plan for cottage education. And I listened, and the house was quiet around us in the way it had become, the deep quiet of a place that is well and occupied and at rest. I was not a sentimental man, but I knew what I had, and I was not fool enough not to know it. Let me tell you about the letter. It came in the 4th year, on a gray November morning, and it was from Lord Hallerton. He was selling Hallerton House. He was, as his letter explained, at the age of 72, of a mind to consolidate, and the property had become more trouble to maintain than it was worth to him, and he wondered whether I might be interested in acquiring it. I took the letter to the library, where Cecily was working. She read it again. She put it down on the table and looked at it with an expression I was watching carefully, because I was not sure which way it would go. "He wants to sell it," she said. "Yes." "The house where she stopped, where the exhibition was held." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "What do you think?" "I think it's a reasonable property at a price that is probably negotiable," I said. "I think the question is what you want to do with it, because I would not buy it without knowing that." She looked at the letter. "I want to turn it into a school," she said. I was quiet. "A large one," she said quickly. I don't mean some great institutional project. I mean something specific, for girls from families like mine. Girls whose fathers have died in debt, who have real intelligence and no way to use it, and who are going to end up at something like that exhibition because there is no other option." She paused. "Lady Fenwick's plan for cottage education is the right idea, but smaller than it needs to be. What I mean is a school for girls of limited means. Real education, not accomplishments, real subjects." I looked at her. She looked back at me with the expression I had first seen across the table at Hallerton House, the one that said she had thought about this clearly, and she knew what she thought, and she was going to say it. "Buy the house," I said. A pause, just like that. "Just like that," I said. "I'll have the solicitors draw up the offer by the end of the week." She was still looking at me. Something shifted in her face, something that was not surprise exactly, but was close to it, in the way she sometimes still looked at me in moments where she had apparently not fully expected to be agreed with. "It will cost money," she said. "Not just the property, the renovation, the endowment to keep it running. It won't turn a profit." "I'm aware of that," I said. "It matters to you what happens to the estate." "Cecily," I said, "the estate is doing well. The western pasture is doing extraordinarily well, largely because you and Harwick were right about the tile drainage. We are not in difficulty. And even if we were," I stopped. "Even if we were, I would still tell you to buy the house and make it into a school because you have been thinking about this for a year at minimum, and I have been watching you think about it and waiting for you to say it." She looked at me. "You've been watching me think about it?" she repeated. "You had the look," I said. "Since Lady Fenwick's party, the one you get when you're working something out." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "You notice that?" "I notice most things about you," I said. "I have done since Hallerton House. It is a tendency I seem to have developed and show no signs of recovering from." She looked down at the letter on the table. Then she looked up at me. "All right," she said, "we'll buy the house." We bought Hallerton House in December of the 4th year, and the renovation began in the spring, and by the autumn of the 5th year the school was open. James came to the opening. He was 20 now, taller than I was, and had finished his first year at his studies and was burning with ideas about hydraulic systems and their application to industrial manufacture, which he explained to me at length, and which I followed well enough to ask useful questions, and which I noticed he found gratifying in the slightly surprised way of a young man who has not entirely expected to be asked useful questions. Lady Fenwick came to the opening and gave a speech that was both appropriate and mercifully short. Edmund came and stood beside me in the entrance hall that I had last stood in 3 years previous, watching Cecily come down that staircase with Pask behind her, and said nothing, which was unusual enough for Edmund that I looked at him. His face had an expression I had not seen on him before, something like awe, I thought, though Edmund would have denied it. The school was called Marne House. I had not suggested the name. It was Cecily's own choice, and she made it without discussion, simply because it was right, and because she felt the debt she owed the person she had been in those early years, the woman in the gray gown with the practical book and the honest account of her own position, who had walked out of this house on a Tuesday morning with nothing except her own character and had built the rest. 22 girls enrolled in the first year, 41 in the second. By the 5th year of its operation, the school had a waiting list. Cecily ran it with the same precision she brought to the estate drainage, which is to say with attention to the actual problem and no patience for the approach that looked well but did not work. The teachers she found were exceptional. The curriculum included mathematics, history, natural philosophy, estate management, and French, because Cecily had read that journal in French and thought every woman should have the option. There were no accomplishments lessons unless a girl specifically wanted them. There was no instruction in the art of being decorative or pleasing. There was instruction in the art of thinking clearly and speaking plainly and knowing one's subject. I visited on Wednesday mornings, because by the 3rd year Cecily had instituted a Wednesday morning lecture series and had asked me to give one, and then found she could not easily ask me to stop, because the girls asked questions that turned out to be interesting. I had a particular lecture that I gave 3 times on the management of a large estate in bad conditions, drought, flood, a bad harvest, which I had drawn from my campaigning experience with supply chains, and from watching Harwick and Cecily manage 2 difficult summers on the Varnholt estate. The girls asked questions about decision-making under uncertainty that I found sharper than most of the questions I had fielded from junior officers. In the 7th year of the school, one of its graduates, a girl named Patience Alcott, daughter of a Cumberland vicar who had died of influenza leaving 4 children and a small collection of debts, obtained a position as estate manager to a widowed countess in the north, which was the first time I was aware of such a thing happening, and which Cecily and Lady Fenwick discussed at dinner with a satisfaction that I found, quietly, extremely gratifying. I told you I was not a sentimental man. I have been honest with you about most things, and I will be honest about this. I was wrong. Or rather, I had confused sentiment with weakness, and I had concluded from that confusion that I did not feel the things I in fact felt, because I could not afford to feel weak. What I discovered in the years of Cecily was that feeling deeply is not the same as being weak, and that tenderness is not the same as vulnerability, and that the capacity to look at another person's face and feel the particular warmth that means they are the person you most want to be in a room with, that this is not a disadvantage. It is, in fact, the truest advantage I have ever possessed. I was afraid of it in those early years. I recognized that now, though I could not have said so then. I had learned in the campaign years and before them that attachment was a liability, not wrong to feel but dangerous to rely on because the things you were attached to could be taken. My mother had died when I was 15. Friends had died in the north. I had learned to hold things at a certain distance. Cecily did not allow that distance. Not aggressively, she was not an aggressive person in that way, but simply by being who she was, which was a person so straightforwardly and unperformatively real that the distance I maintained became, over time, not a protection but a deficiency, a thing I was missing out on. I no longer miss out on it. Let me tell you about the morning of our 10th anniversary. October again. The estate in its autumn colors, the chalk stream running clear and low in the dry spell, the western pasture, now carrying 3 times the stock of the year I bought it, which still gave me satisfaction every time I looked at it, going gold in the morning light. We walked the boundary together, as we had done at the beginning. She took my arm at the gate, as she had done since the February morning when I asked her to marry me, which was one of those small, repeated things that a man finds over years to be not small at all. 10 years, she said. Yes. Do you know what I was thinking about this morning? Tell me. That book, she said. The drainage treatise. I put it back on Hallerton's shelf when we bought the house, and it's in the school library now. The girls use it. I laughed. Do they? One of them asked me last Wednesday where I first encountered it. I told her at a marriage exhibition, which she found very funny. A pause. It is very funny in retrospect. It is, I agreed. We walked in silence for a while. The cold October light on the grass and the chalk stream and the long view south that I had looked out over 10 years ago when she said yes, on a gray February morning with ice along the stream margins. Marcus, she said. Yes. I want to tell you something. Tell me. She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the estate. Then she said, I told you at the beginning that what you might take for acceptance was also, in part, the absence of any real choice. I want to say now with complete accuracy that that has not been true for a very long time. I don't know at what point it stopped being true. The storm, perhaps. The walk in February. Sometime before that, probably. But I want you to know that for most of these 10 years, I have been here because I chose to be. Not because I had to be, because this is where I want to be. I looked at her in the October light. I know, I said. Do you? I've known for some years, I said, but I'm glad you said it. She looked at me with the same amber-brown eyes I had first looked into at Hallerton House, which were the same eyes and had not changed, and which still did the same thing to me that they had done on that first morning, made it very difficult to look away. You are a ridiculous man, she said, for someone reputed to be so frightening. I'm aware, I said. You've mentioned it before. I'll mention it again, she said, probably tomorrow. I'll look forward to it, I said. She laughed. She tucked her arm more firmly through mine. We walked back toward the house in the October morning, through the estate that was ours, and Harwick was somewhere behind the barn doing something structural, and James was due on Thursday with Petworth and a new set of engineering diagrams, and there was a school 40 miles away in a yellow-stoned house that was full of 20-year-old women learning to think clearly and speak plainly and know their subject. I was not a sentimental man, but I knew what I had found on a Tuesday morning in October at the far end of a room, in a plain gray gown, reading a book about drainage systems. I knew exactly what I had found, and I had spent every year since making sure she knew it too. I want to go back and tell you more carefully about the first year, because I have skipped over it too quickly, and the first year deserves its own account. We were married in March, as I said, and we came home to Varnholt House as husband and wife on a wet Thursday in early spring, with the lane to the house running with water from the last of the winter rains and the park looking exactly like itself, which is to say slightly melancholy in the rain and considerably better when the sun came out. Mrs. Harwick had organized a small welcome, a dinner, the good china, the flowers from the forcing house, and she received us at the front steps with a warmth that I had come to understand over the years was her fundamental character expressing itself through the medium of household management. Cecily thanked her with the directness that was her habit, and asked 3 immediate practical questions about the state of the east wing ceiling, fully repaired, the drainage schedule for the western pasture, on track for the following month, and the welfare of a particular tenant family at the edge of the estate, whose situation she had been concerned about since January, improved. The eldest son had found work at the mill. Mrs. Harwick answered each question with the precision of someone who had recognized, some months prior, that she was dealing with a mistress who actually wanted the answers and not merely the reassurance, and the 2 of them stood on the front steps in the March rain for 4 minutes discussing tile drainage and tenant welfare, while I stood slightly to one side and watched, and felt something I would have called contentment, if I were in the habit of naming things. We went inside. Dinner was excellent. We sat at the long table in the dining room, which was too long for 2 people, but which we had both decided to use anyway, sitting at one end, close enough to talk without raising our voices, which turned out to be the right decision because we talked through dinner and past it, into the candles burning low. About the spring planting and James's most recent letter, and a pamphlet Cecily had read on the reform of parish relief, and the question of whether the chalk stream was likely to flood in a wet spring, and what precautions Harwick had in place. It was, objectively, a conversation about agricultural and administrative matters. It was also, I thought, as I sat in the candlelight listening to her argue for the extension of the Tenant Support Fund in a bad year, one of the finest conversations I had ever had. Because she was arguing it with her own mind, her own reasons, her own evidence, not performing a version of interest in what interested me, but genuinely and independently engaged with the same problems I was engaged with from her own angle. I had not known I was lonely for that. The days settled into their pattern. She rose early, earlier than I did, as a rule, which surprised me the first time I came down at 7:30, and found her already in the library with the lamp lit and a second cup of tea on the table. She read in the mornings. She walked the estate in the late morning or the early afternoon, sometimes with Harwick, sometimes alone, sometimes with me on the days when I was not occupied with other correspondence, or with the estate business that accumulated in the way of all business. The letters from tenants, the accounts with the mill and the timber merchant, the solicitor's quarterly reports. She came to my study on Tuesday mornings to discuss the week's affairs with Harwick and me together, which Harwick had initially approached with the wariness of a man uncertain how this arrangement was meant to work, and which had settled, by the 3rd or 4th week, into something that functioned with considerable efficiency because Cecily and Harwick shared an approach to problems that was essentially the same. Identify the actual obstacle, find the most direct solution. Do not spend time on the elegant solution when the plain one will serve. I watched this happen and felt a satisfaction about it that I recognized as disproportionate to the occasion and did not attempt to correct. There were also the evenings. This is what I find most difficult to describe, looking back, because nothing dramatic happened in them. We sat in the drawing room or the library. We read, sometimes separately, sometimes she read aloud to me, which she had offered to do after noticing that I had a tendency to fall into a kind of alert, but unproductive stillness in the evenings when there was nothing immediately requiring my attention. A state that she diagnosed, correctly, as a man who had spent 20 years in near constant action and did not quite know what to do with quiet. She read to me from things she was working through, the French Agricultural Journal, translated with her own commentary, a history of estate management in the Tudor period that she found genuinely funny, for reasons she explained at length. A novel twice, because the first time she chose it for the agrarian economics, and the second time she admitted she simply liked it. It was the second time, through the novel, that I understood something. We were several chapters in, on an evening in May when the windows were open to the warm night, and the smell of the park came through, and she stopped in the middle of a passage and said, quietly, without looking up from the page, "I didn't think it was going to be like this." "Like what?" I asked. She considered. "Comfortable," she said. "That sounds wrong. Not comfortable like not easy. You're not easy particularly." She looked up then, briefly. "You're very certain about things, and you argue and you don't give way unless you're genuinely convinced, which is as it should be, but it does mean that certain conversations require effort." "You give as good as you get," I said. I do, she agreed. But what I mean is, I expected the arrangement to be a management exercise, something I was doing, not something I was inside of. She looked back at the book. I expected to be doing it from outside, and instead I find I'm in it. In the evenings and the mornings and the Tuesday meetings and all of it, I'm in it. I was quiet for a moment. Is that unwelcome? I asked. She looked at me, and the look was the warm one, the one she kept for people she trusted, that had become, over the months, specifically the look she kept for me. No, she said, it is the opposite of unwelcome. She went back to the novel. I sat in the lamplight and listened to her read and thought about what she had said, and felt the large, steady warmth of it. The spring passed into summer, and summer brought the first real test of the new drainage works, because June was wet, the wettest June, the county said, in 11 years. And the clay pasture that had flooded reliably every wet spring for as long as anyone could remember did not flood. The tile runs carried the water cleanly to the field ditch, and from there to the chalk stream and away, and the pasture stood firm and green and sound, and Harwick walked the boundary with an expression of vindicated satisfaction that I had rarely seen him wear. Cecily, who was with him for the inspection, came home and sat down at the kitchen table while Mrs. Harwick's cook was making bread, and ate a piece of bread and butter and said, with deep satisfaction, "The herringbone held." I was told this by Mrs. Harwick afterward, who had clearly found it moving, though she expressed this through the medium of an unusually excellent dinner that evening. We had our first real argument in July. It was about a tenant matter, a family in the West Cottages who had fallen behind on their rent, and whose situation I had intended to address in the autumn when the harvest accounts were settled. Cecily thought this was wrong, and said so with the particular clarity she brought to things she thought were wrong, which is to say, she laid out her reasons precisely, and then looked at me and waited. I said I had my reasons, which were financial. She said the financial reasons didn't hold when examined, and showed me why. I said there were other considerations. She said there were always other considerations, and that they were generally used to postpone doing the right thing until the right thing became impossible, and what was the actual obstacle. I said I didn't appreciate being managed. She said she wasn't managing me, she was arguing with me, and there was a difference, and I should tell her what I actually thought rather than deflecting into questions of approach. We argued for 45 minutes. It was, I recognized even at the time, an argument between two people who both had the complete attention of the other, and both intended to be heard, and both expected to give genuine reasons rather than to win by force. And it was, for all that it was uncomfortable, a very fine argument. At the end of it I said, "You're right about the financial reasons. The other considerations are, I had it in my head that we shouldn't be seen to be lenient early in the year, that it would be taken as weakness by the other tenants." "That's the real reason," she said. "Yes. Do you still think it's right?" I considered. "No," I said. "When I say it out loud it sounds like pride, not policy." She nodded. "I thought so." "You might have said so 40 minutes ago." "I didn't know what you were actually thinking until you said it." We settled the tenant matter the following morning, in the way Cecily had proposed, and it was the right outcome, and the family in the West Cottages, whose name was Crane, and who had 3 young children and a 5th on the way, were, as I was informed the following autumn, among the most reliable payers on the estate, with the punctuality of people who have been treated well and intend to prove they deserve it. Cecily said nothing further about the argument. She did not return to it, did not revisit it, did not append it to future disagreements as evidence of a pattern. It was settled, and she moved on, and I recognized this as the habit of a person who argues in order to solve problems rather than to establish superiority, and who therefore has no use for a resolved argument once it is resolved. I recognized this because I did the same thing, and it was the first time in my life I had met someone else who did. James came for the summer. He was 15 and a half, and he had spent the term becoming very serious about engineering, which expressed itself as an intense and detailed interest in everything mechanical on the estate. The mill at the edge of the park, the pump mechanism that supplied the home farm, the clock in the gallery, which he had now decided was definitely of French origin, and was prepared to defend this at some length. He spent 2 weeks of his holiday building a working model of the mill, in the carpentry room with the head groom, who had a gift for woodwork, and who seemed to find James's combination of theoretical knowledge and total impracticality genuinely entertaining. The model worked mostly, with certain modifications that James explained to me in detail. In the evenings he sat with Cecily and me in the drawing room. He was not by nature a drawing room person. He was a person who thought with his hands and needed to be doing things, but he had the quality, shared with his sister, of genuine attention. He listened when you spoke. He noticed things. He asked questions that went past the surface. One evening he asked me about the campaign. I had not, as a rule, talked about the campaign to people who had not been there. There are things that don't translate, not because they are too terrible, though some of them were, but because the experience of sustained danger produces a way of seeing the world that is different from the peacetime version, and I had never been sure how to bridge that difference in conversation. But James asked, and James was 15 and a half and had a mind like a good instrument, precise, well-made, capable of more than one register, and so I told him about the bridge. Not the burning of it, the engineering of it. The question that had been put to me by my commanding officer 2 days before the retreat: could the bridge be made to collapse on a delayed mechanism so that it went down after our forces had crossed and before the opposing forces could follow? And I had said that I thought it could, and I had worked out the mechanism with the head of the engineering division, a man named Prill who had a gift for structures, and we had tested the principle on a smaller bridge the day before, and it had worked. Did it work? James asked. His voice was very even. He was watching me with the attention that was his characteristic look. The bridge went down at the right time, I said. The retreat completed, the men got across. What happened to the men on the bridge when it went down? I looked at him. He looked back at me steadily. There were some men on the bridge, I said. We had miscalculated the pace of the retreat by 20 minutes. There were men on the bridge. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You knew that would happen when you gave the order." I knew it might happen, and I knew that if the bridge didn't go down, the retreat would fail, and we would lose not 20 men but potentially 2,000. 20 for 2,000, he said. Yes. And you still sleep at night, he said. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, the question of a young man who is trying to understand something about decision-making at its most extreme. Not easily, I said. Not for some years, but yes. He nodded slowly. Then he said, I've been reading about bridge construction. The tension structure is the interesting part, the way the load distributes. And we moved to bridge construction and remained there for the better part of an hour. And at some point, Cecily set down her book and listened, and occasionally added something, and the evening ended quietly and well. Afterward, when James had gone up to bed, Cecily said, You answered him honestly. He asked honestly, I said. She looked at me. There are men who would have either refused to answer or given him the general's version. The version that sounds like strategy and not like 20 men. He deserved the real version, I said. He's going to be an engineer. He'll make decisions that have consequences. Better he understand what that means now. She was quiet for a moment, then she said yes, and then thank you. For what? For understanding him, she said. For talking to him like that, she paused. He doesn't have a father, he hasn't for long enough that it's become a fact rather than a wound. But there are things a woman can't give him that I've known for years and not known how to solve. And you, she stopped. You give him them. Without making a production of it. I did not know what to say to that. I said nothing for a moment, and then I said, He gives me things too. Does he? He asks questions I wouldn't ask myself, I said. He makes me say things out loud that I wouldn't otherwise say. That's, I paused. That has value. Cecily looked at me for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, We are very lucky, Marcus. Yes, I said, we are. In the autumn of the first year, there was a gathering of the local landowners, a quarterly meeting of the kind that had been held in the county for as long as anyone could recall, at which the various practical matters of estate management and tenant welfare and parish affairs were discussed with varying degrees of useful result. I had attended these meetings for 12 years since inheriting the title, and I had found them useful to the extent that useful information sometimes passed at them, and I had otherwise endured them as a cost of doing business. Cecily asked to come to the October meeting. I looked at her. I know it's not the custom, she said, But I've been involved in the estate decisions since March, and there are two items on the agenda that directly affect matters I've been managing: the chalk stream boundary question and the parish poor relief amendment. I would rather hear the discussion directly than receive your account of it. I thought about this for a moment. I thought about whether there would be difficulty, whether the assembled landowners and their wives and factors would take exception to Cecily's presence, whether it would create complications that would cost more than the benefit. Then I thought about the fact that I had never, in 12 years, asked myself whether my own presence at these meetings might create complications. "Come," I said. She came. The meeting was held at the house of Sir Thomas Alcock, who was a broad, red-faced, fundamentally decent man who had been one of my neighbors for 15 years, and who expressed his fundamental decency in the form of bluntness delivered without malice. He received us at the door with an expression that navigated rapidly from surprise to consideration to something I could only call a kind of practical acceptance, and said, "Lady Varnholt, I don't recall we've had a woman at the Quarterly before." "I don't recall either," Cecily said pleasantly. "Shall we go in?" We went in. The assembled landowners, 9 of them, plus 3 factors, plus 2 wives who had come for the social portion and stayed out of curiosity, received us with varying degrees of the same rapid navigation from surprise to acceptance. There was one exception, a man named Carver who farmed the northern estate and who had views about the appropriate roles of women in public business that he had expressed on previous occasions, and now expressed again, briefly, through the medium of a look that Cecily met with such complete and serene lack of reaction that he appeared briefly confused, and said nothing further. The chalk stream boundary question was raised in the second hour. It was a long-running dispute about the precise line of the boundary between the Varnholt property and the neighboring Aldenton estate, as it ran through the stream, which had shifted its course somewhat over the previous decade, and which had consequently shifted the boundary in ways that both estates had varying accounts of. Cecily spoke to the question after the third presentation of conflicting evidence. She spoke briefly and precisely, having clearly studied the documents, and she identified the actual point of disagreement, which was not the current course of the stream, but the original surveyor's definition of the boundary, which referred to a feature that no longer existed, and proposed a solution that addressed the actual problem rather than the symptom. The room was quiet while she spoke. After she finished, there was a pause, and then Harwick, who was present as my factor, said, "That's right," in the tone of a man confirming a correct answer. The boundary question was resolved, in the form she proposed, in 30 minutes. Sir Thomas Alcock spoke to me afterward, while Cecily was in conversation with one of the wives near the window. "Your wife," he said, with the directness of a man who is accustomed to saying what he thinks, "has a good head for this." "She does," I agreed. "Will she come again?" "I expect so." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said, with the air of a man who has decided something. "Good." And he went to speak to someone else, and I turned to find Cecily watching me from across the room with a slight, private smile that told me she had heard. She came to every subsequent meeting for the next 9 years, until the formation of the Improvement Society, at which she became the corresponding secretary, and the meetings became hers. I want to tell you about the second winter, because it was the winter when I understood something about my own character that I had not known before. It was a cold December, colder than the first, with snow from the 3rd week of the month and the chalk stream iced solid for the first time in 4 years. The estate battened down in the way of long practice fuel laid in, the home farm stock brought under shelter, the tenant cottages checked by Harwick's men for drafts and failing wood, the lane to the house salted and kept clear. Cecily organized the tenant welfare check with Mrs. Harwick in the 1st week of December before the worst of the cold came. This was not a task that had been formally organized before. It had been done, but loosely, by whatever member of the household had time, and Cecily's organization of it produced a map of every tenant family, their situation and their specific need, which was then addressed systematically over the following 2 weeks by a rotating roster of household staff. "This should have existed for years," she said, looking at the map. "Yes," I said. "Why didn't it?" I considered. "Because no one organized it," I said, "and because it is the kind of thing that gets done adequately in most years and then in a bad year." "Fails," she said. "Yes." She kept the map, She updated it each winter. It is, I believe, still updated by the housekeeper at Varnholt today, in the form she established in that December, though the precise organization has been modified by circumstances over the years. But that is not what I want to tell you about. What I want to tell you about is a night in mid-December, when the cold was at its worst, and the snow was deep, and the wind was coming from the north with the particular quality of northern winter wind that had been a part of my campaigning years, and which I had not, in truth, been easy in the presence of since. I do not, as a rule, speak of the campaign in ways that touch on the fact that I find certain things difficult. I have said that I do not sleep easily, and I said that to James because he had asked a genuine question. Beyond that, I do not speak of it. The campaign was 20 years ago. I was 37 when I met Cecily, and the campaign had been my 20s and my early 30s, and the things it left in me were things I had managed for 20 years, through the medium of occupation and self-discipline, and the particular version of not looking that I had developed to a fine art. The north wind, on certain nights, undid some of that. Cecily found me in the library at 1 in the morning, sitting in the chair near the fire with my boots on and a book in my hand that I was not reading. She was in her dressing gown with her hair loose, which meant she had been to bed and then come down, which meant she had noticed I was gone. She sat down in the chair across from me without saying anything. I said, "The wind." "Yes," she said, "I know." I looked at her. "How do you know?" "You do something when you hear it," she said. "You're whole, you go still, but differently from your ordinary stillness. I noticed it last December, too. I wasn't sure what it was then." "And now?" "Now I know it's the campaign," she said. "I don't know exactly what, you don't have to tell me." I looked at the fire for a moment. Then I said, "There were winters in the north. The wind sounded like that." A pause. "Men died of it, not in battle, in the cold in their tents when the supply lines failed and the firewood didn't come. I made decisions about who received what was available, calculations." 20 for 2,000, she said softly. "Always that calculation," I said. "In one form or another. And you make it correctly, you make it rightly in every military sense, and you carry it." She was quiet. "I don't regret the decisions," I said. "That's not what it is. It's more that the wind sounds like that, and my mind goes back there, and I can't." I stopped. "I'm very competent in emergencies," I said. "You said so." "I did." "This is the other side of that," I said. "The emergencies I can solve don't keep me awake. The ones I couldn't, the men I couldn't save, the calculations that were correct but cost, those come back." She looked at me across the fireplace. "I know," she said. "I know you don't need me to tell you to sleep, or that it was a long time ago, or that you did what was right." She paused. "I know you know all of that." "Then why are you here?" I said, not unkindly, genuinely. She thought about it for a moment. "Because the wind is loud," she said, "and you were down here alone with it, and I didn't want you to be." I looked at her. "Cecily," I said. "Yes." I stopped. I had the sensation of trying to name something in a language I was not fluent in, not because I didn't know the thing, but because I had never needed the words for it and had not practiced them. "I know," she said. And she got up from her chair and moved to mine, which was large enough, and sat beside me. And the fire burned low, and the north wind was loud in the chimney. And I sat in the lamplight with Cecily Marne, who was now Cecily Varnholt, and was not alone. I did not say anything else. Neither did she. We sat until the wind dropped, which was sometime past 3 in the morning, and then we went up to bed, and I slept. This happened in one form or another 4 or 5 times in the years that followed, in bad winters when the north wind had that particular quality. She always came down. She always sat. She never pressed me to speak, and I spoke or didn't, and she stayed regardless. It is the thing I am least able to describe to people who ask what we are to each other, because it is the kind of thing that looks small, a woman sitting beside a man in the middle of the night, and is not small at all. In the 3rd year, we built the school. I say we because that is what it was, though the vision was Cecily's and the execution was Cecily's, and the day-to-day management was entirely Cecily's. What I contributed was the house, the money, the willingness not to ask for a financial return, and I was told at the opening by Lady Fenwick, who was not a woman who said things she did not mean, a very good example of the correct attitude for a husband to have. "I've known a great many men of property. Lady Fenwick said to me at the opening, who would have found a dozen reasons why their wives couldn't manage a school. Mostly reasons that had to do with dignity, theirs, not their wives. You didn't do that. There was no good reason to, I said. There rarely is, she said. That's never been the obstacle. I thought about that for some time afterward. The school changed things in ways I had not anticipated. It changed Cecily first. Not fundamentally, she was the same person, the same mind, the same voice that had said across the table at Hallerton House, "That's not what I'm thanking you for." But there was a particular quality in her that had been, in the years before the school, something she had to apply to whatever was in front of her, because the estate and the household were what was in front of her, and she was thorough and capable, and they benefited from her attention. After the school, that quality had its own object. The thing she brought to problems had a problem of its own choosing, one that engaged her in the way that the drainage and the tenant welfare had never quite reached, because the school was hers in a way the estate was not. She was, in the school years, the most alive I had ever seen her. Not more herself, she was always entirely herself, and I had never known her when she wasn't. But there was a particular brightness in the mornings when she was going to the school, and in the evenings when she came back with accounts of what the girls were doing. That was the brightness of someone engaged in the right work. I watched it and felt the same thing I had felt watching her argue with Harwick about tile drainage. A satisfaction that was partly about her, and partly about the world being arranged correctly, in the way that the sight of a well-built wall or a sound bridge produces not just aesthetic pleasure, but a sense of rightness. The school changed the girls. That goes without saying, perhaps, but I want to say it anyway. I came to know some of them over the years, first as faces at Wednesday lectures, then as real people who asked real questions, and later, in several cases, as women building their own lives. Patience Alcott, who became an estate manager. A girl named Mary Trevelyan, who went on to run the accounts for her brother's shipping firm and whose work there, by her own account in a letter to Cecily, had transformed its financial management. A girl named Sarah Horwood, whose father had been a failed merchant, who learned French and German at Marne House and became a translator, and who sent Cecily a copy of her first published translation with a note that said only, "Because of you." These women were not visible to the world in the way that politicians and generals are visible. They did not appear in newspapers or in the dispatches that I had, in my military years, been trained to read as the account of what mattered. They managed accounts and translated and ran households and trained the next generation of competent young women, and they did it in the places where real life is actually conducted, at the level where decisions have direct consequences for real people. Cecily said something about this once that I have thought about many times since. She said, "The world talks a great deal about legacy, meaning things that are written down, but most of what changes anything is just competent people doing good work steadily over time. It doesn't get written down, but it adds up." I thought about the bridge, 20 for 2,000, the kind of decision that appears in dispatches and in histories that gets written down, that is credited in the official account. And I thought about Mrs. Crane in the West Cottage, whose children had grown up because we had resolved a rent dispute correctly in July of the first year, and whose eldest daughter had attended Marne House in the 6th year, and who was now, I had been told recently, working as a lady's companion in the North with the household management skills she had learned at the school. Not a dispatch, not a history, a woman who had something she hadn't had before. Both things were true, both added up. I told Cecily this once, and she looked at me for a moment and then said, "You've been thinking about Mrs. Crane." "I think about her occasionally," I said. "You also think about the bridge." "I always think about the bridge." "Yes," she said, "I know," a pause. "But you think about Mrs. Crane too, you have since the beginning." Another pause. "That matters, Marcus, more than you know." In the 7th year of our marriage, Edmund married. Her name was Lady Charlotte Aldwick, and she was 31, a widow with a small son, and she was exactly what Edmund had always been going to choose: clever, warm, unimpressed by the merely ornamental, and with a quality of practical good sense that had been, in Edmund's case, the consistent attraction across the years. She and Cecily became friends with a rapidity that I found unsurprising and Edmund found moving, and the two of them, combined, were a formidable domestic and intellectual partnership that occasionally unnerved me slightly, and which I had the good sense never to say so. Charlotte's son, Edward, was 4 when they married, and 7 when I first noticed that he was following me around the estate with the systematic determination of a small person who has identified an objective. I mentioned this to Edmund, who said it had been happening for some months, and that he had not interfered because the results had been, so far, educational for both parties. "He thinks you're the most interesting person he's met," Edmund said. "He told me you know everything about buildings." "I know a reasonable amount about structures," I said. "He wants to be an engineer," Edmund said. "James has been talking to him about the mill model." "James is 23, I said. "He's not appropriate for a 7-year-old's engineering education." "He's been very good about it," Edmund said. "Very patient. James has rather good instincts for," he paused, "for the James that you and Cecily helped make, the one that knows how to explain things to people who aren't already expert." I looked at Edmund. "Don't look at me like that," Edmund said pleasantly. "You know it's true." I knew it was true. I did not say so because Edmund, like all younger brothers, did not need his assessments confirmed any more than strictly necessary. Edward became a regular presence at the estate, and at the Wednesday lectures at the school, where he sat in the back row with the expression of a person taking very careful notes, and where Cecily treated him with exactly the combination of seriousness and warmth that made him, within 2 lectures, her devoted partisan. He called her Aunt Cecily, which was the first time anyone had called Cecily an aunt, and which produced an expression on her face that I observed and did not comment on, but which I kept. In the 8th year, James got engaged. Her name was Harriet Petworth, the sister of his friend, the boy who had come to stay and spent his visit in the library. She was 22, with a mind that I could confirm was as precise as her brother's, and who had studied at a ladies' college in Edinburgh, and who had, I discovered in the course of our first real conversation, read everything Cecily had written for the school curriculum and had opinions about all of it. James brought her to Varnholt in the spring to meet us, or rather, as I understood very quickly, to meet Cecily, who was in some sense the approval he most needed. I watched Cecily and Harriet together that first afternoon in the library, where Harriet had gone directly, and where Cecily had found her 20 minutes later. I passed the door once, and heard them arguing about the relative merits of 2 approaches to teaching natural philosophy to girls of different mathematical backgrounds, in the tone of 2 people who have found an equal and are testing the discovery. James appeared at my elbow, where he had been hovering. "Is it all right?" he said. I looked at him. He was 25 now, tall and serious, with Cecily's amber eyes and the slight forward lean of a man concentrating hard on something. "Is it all right?" I said. "James, you can hear them through the door." He listened. Cecily was making a point about scaffolded versus unscaffolded problem-solving. Harriet was disagreeing with citations. "Yes," he said. "All right." He went away looking like a man who has received the news he most wanted. The wedding was in September. It was, by the standards of weddings I have attended, one of the better ones, short in duration, honest in tone, followed by a dinner at which a great deal was said that was worth saying, and at which Cecily made a speech that was, without being sentimental, the most exact account of what her brother was and what she wished for him that I had ever heard. I held her hand under the table during James's speech, which was somewhat tangled and extremely genuine, and she held mine, and we were quiet together in the middle of the noise of the thing. Afterward, in the carriage home, she leaned against my arm in the familiar way and was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "He's going to be all right." "He is," I agreed. "He was always going to be," she said, "but I wasn't always sure I knew how." "You showed him," I said, "all of it." She was quiet again. "Then you helped." "Occasionally." "More than occasionally," she said. We went home in the September dark, and the estate was quiet when we arrived, and the house was lit and warm, and we went to bed in the comfortable silence that was, by the 9th year of our marriage, as natural as breathing. I said at the start of this account that I was not a sentimental man. I want to qualify that. Sentimentality, as I understand it, is the attachment to a feeling for its own sake, the indulgence of emotion for the pleasure of the emotion, regardless of whether it corresponds to anything real. A sentimental man looks at the past and finds it better than it was. A sentimental man attaches to things because they are familiar, not because they are good. A sentimental man cries at the right moments on social occasions and feels virtuous for it. I am not that. But there is another kind of feeling, the kind that corresponds precisely to the real thing that produced it, that is accurate rather than indulgent, that tells you truthfully what is good and what matters and what you would be wrong to let go of. That kind of feeling I have come to believe in. I have come to believe that it is, in fact, one of the most reliable instruments I possess. And what I feel when I look at the 10 years of the life I have described, when I look at Cecily in the library on a winter morning with the lamp lit and the French agricultural journal, when I look at her walking the western boundary in her plain dark coat, when I look at the school at Hallerton with its 22 first students growing to 41, and then more, when I look at James's face when Harriet won Cecily's approval, when I look at Edward in the back row of the Wednesday lecture taking careful notes, what I feel is precisely accurate. This is the right life. This is exactly what it is. That is not sentiment, that is measurement. And the instrument that measured it, the one that told me on a Tuesday morning at Hallerton House to sit down beside a woman reading about drainage systems in a plain gray gown, that was, I now understand, the best instrument I had. Better than the tactical sense I trained for 20 years. Better than the financial judgment I had applied to the estate for 12. Better than the strategic mind that generals praised in their dispatches. I trusted it once, and it was right. I trust it still. I am the War Duke of Varnholt, which is a name that has meant a number of things over the years. To the men who served under me, it meant a particular kind of certainty in the field and a particular kind of fairness in the tent. To the county, it has come to mean the man whose estate is well run and whose wife runs a school. To Edmund, it has always meant simply Marcus, which is both more and less than any title. To Cecily, I have asked her this directly in the 10th year. It means, she said, the man I went looking for in a storm and found and have not stopped finding since. That is not a military assessment. It is, I believe, the truest thing that has been said about me. I carry it accordingly. Let me tell you about the summer of the 6th year, because it was the summer that tested everything and showed me what everything was made of. It began with rain, too much of it too soon, in May when the ground was not yet ready to carry it. The chalk stream rose faster than anyone expected. By the 3rd week of May, it was over its banks in the South Field, which had not happened in 9 years, and by the end of the month, it had reached the lower edge of the home farm and taken part of the feed store. Harwick, who had been watching the stream with the attention of a man who has seen it do this before and does not want to be surprised, had already taken precautions. The feed store contents had been moved, the home farm stock shifted to higher ground, the lower cottages checked. So the flood, when it came, found a prepared estate rather than an unprepared one, and the cost was manageable. But the thing about a wet May is that it tends toward a wet June and a doubtful harvest. And a doubtful harvest means a difficult autumn for the tenant families. And a difficult autumn is the beginning of a chain that ends, in the worst cases, in families who cannot pay and children who do not eat properly. Cecily recognized this sequence in late May, when the rain was still falling, and began to address it then rather than in the autumn when it would be harder. She organized an expanded version of the winter welfare map, applied, this time, to the summer, with attention to which families had saved from the previous year's good harvest, and which had not, and which had children of school age who might benefit from the supplementary meals program she had been running at the school since the 2nd year. The supplementary meals program was not, formally, a school program. It was a Thursday arrangement at the schoolhouse, in which a number of families in the area brought their children for a midday meal that was cooked by the school's kitchen and paid for from a fund that Cecily had established from the household budget, and supplemented by contributions from Lady Fenwick and 2 other local women who had been associated with the school since its opening. The children who came received a meal. They also received, whether or not they were enrolled at the school, an hour with the youngest girls who were learning to teach, practice for the teachers, company, and activity for the children. I had known about the program since its beginning. I had not, until the summer of the 6th year, understood what it actually was. I went to the school on a Thursday in June to collect Cecily for a meeting that Harwick had requested at short notice. I arrived at noon, which I had not done before, and came through the garden gate at the back of the school and found the courtyard full. There were perhaps 40 children in the courtyard. Some of them were from the school, the older girls, who were acting as the easy practice supervisors of a large group of younger children. Some of them very young, toddlers being held by hand or sitting on spread blankets. The tables from the schoolroom had been brought out, and they were set with bowls and bread and a large pot of something that smelled very good in the warm June air. Cecily was in the middle of it. She was not in her usual dark coat. She was in a lighter dress, a pale blue, and she was crouching beside a child of perhaps 3 who was sitting on the edge of a blanket and refusing, with the comprehensive determination of a 3-year-old, to eat the bread she was being offered. Cecily was speaking to the child in the patient, specific way she used for problems, not in the tone of an adult managing a small person, but in the tone of a person taking the small person's objection seriously and attempting to understand it. I stood at the gate and watched. The child looked at the bread for a moment, and then looked at Cecily, and then, with the abruptness of a small person who has reached a conclusion, took the bread. Cecily straightened, she saw me. She came across the courtyard, navigating the children with the ease of a woman who had been doing this for years. "Harwick's meeting," she said. "Yes," I said, "I can wait if—" "No, I'm ready." She looked back at the courtyard for a moment. One of the older girls, a girl of 16 named Bridget, who was the school's finest mathematics student, and who had the additional gift of being liked by small children, had moved into the space Cecily had vacated and was now sitting beside the toddler with the bread. Cecily watched for a moment, then she turned back to me. "How many children come on Thursdays?" I asked. "Last Thursday it was 43, she said. "In June it's usually more. The summer is harder than the winter, for some of them, because the winter at least has the parish coal allocation." I looked at the courtyard. "We need to expand the fund," I said. She looked at me. "Not just for this summer," I said. "Ongoing, I want to talk to you about what it costs properly, and then I want to fund it properly, not year by year." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've never come on a Thursday before." "No," I said. "I should have come earlier." She looked at me with an expression I had learned, by the 6th year, to read very accurately. The one that was warm and that had, underneath it, something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. The expression of a person who has discovered, again, that they are not done being moved by something they thought they had already accounted for. "All right," she said. "We'll talk about the fund." We talked about the fund that evening, with the household accounts and Harwick's crop projections and Cecily's careful notebooks all spread on the library table, and we arrived at a figure that Cecily called conservative and I called sensible, and the fund was established on that basis, and expanded in the 2nd year because the conservative figure turned out to be insufficient, and expanded again in the 4th year when 3 more local families began to send children. And by the 10th year of the school, the Thursday arrangement had become a known institution in the county that 3 other local women had organized parallel versions of in their own parishes, using a guide that Cecily had written, which was 7 pages long and entirely practical. This is what Cecily did. She looked at a problem, found its actual shape, found the solution that addressed the actual shape, implemented it with the minimum necessary complexity, and then wrote down how she did it so other people could do it too. I have read histories of great men, campaigns and debates and the building of institutions in marble. I have read about the decisions that changed the shape of countries. I know what they look like and how they are described. I also know what the guide to a Thursday lunch program in a county school looks like. 7 pages, clear. The thing that worked, and then the thing that needed adjusting, and then the final version that other people could follow. Both are ways of changing things. Only one gets written down in the histories. In the 9th year, I had occasion to be in London for a fortnight, on a state business that required my personal attention, and that I had been postponing for longer than was prudent. Cecily did not come, because the school was in its most active term, and she had a series of examinations to supervise, and did not wish to leave the girls in the middle of them. We had been married 9 years, and I had not been apart from her for more than a few days since the spring of the 1st year. I recognized this fact and found it, somewhat to my own amusement, a larger thing than I had expected. The business in London was concluded in 12 days, because I moved through it with the efficiency of a man who intends to be somewhere else. I returned to Varnholt on a Tuesday evening, later than expected, because the southbound road had been bad and the journey had taken an extra 2 hours. Cecily was in the library. She looked up from the table when I came through the door, and there was a moment, very brief, just a moment, where her face did the thing it rarely did, which was to show what she felt before she had thought about showing it. And what it showed was simply that I was there, and that this was good, and that she was glad. Then she composed it, in the way she sometimes still did, and said, "The southbound road was bad." "Yes," I said. "How are the examinations?" "Finished yesterday," she said. "Mary Trevelyan got the highest mark in mathematics the school has given since Bridget 2 years ago. I've written to her father." "Her father will have no idea what to do with that information," I said. "He doesn't need to know what to do with it," she said. "Mary needs to know someone told him." I sat down across the table. She was looking at me with the warm look, the unguarded one, the one that had gone directly from the moment she saw me in the doorway to the moment she composed herself. "I missed you," I said. She looked at me. "I know that goes without saying after 9 years," I said. "But I want to say it rather than let it go without saying, because I have grown increasingly convinced that the things that go without saying ought to be said, on the grounds that without saying is a habit and habits are easy to hide behind." She was quiet for a moment. "I missed you too," she said. "Every day," a pause, "that also goes without saying." "Good," I said. "Let's keep not letting it." She smiled, the private smile, the one that started in her eyes before it reached the rest of her face. "Welcome home," she said. "It's good to be home," I said. We sat in the library in the evening light, the estate quiet around us, and talked about Mary Trevelyan's examination and the London business, and the thing that Harwick had been wrong about, and the thing that the solicitors had finally got right, and the letter from James that had arrived the previous Thursday, and the question of whether Edward's developing interest in hydraulics was something to encourage or something to gently redirect. This was the texture of it. This was the thing that I had not known to want and had found without looking, that Tuesday morning at the far end of a room. Not the dramatic gesture, not the claiming before the shocked society. I had done that in a quieter way in Hallerton's Hall, and it had been correct, and I did not regret it. But the thing that made it real was this: the library in the evening, the estate quiet around us. The warm lamp and the table between us, and the easy, inexhaustible conversation that was also, sometimes, comfortable silence, and which was both things without any gap between them. I want to say one more thing, and then I will stop. There is a view from the south front of Varnholt House that I have seen in every light and season for 30 years and more, because I grew up in this house, and I have lived in it for the whole of my adult life except the campaign years. In autumn it is the view I described, the park going gold, the chalk stream in the valley, the long slope of the county to the south. In winter it is gray and clean and very still. In summer it is the kind of view that looks like what people mean when they say England, the kind that appears in pictures above fireplaces in houses that are nostalgic for something they can't quite name. I have stood at the south front and looked at that view 1,000 times. In the 10th year, I was standing there on a Sunday morning in early October, the good light on everything, the morning quiet except for the sound of the birds in the park. I was thinking, as I sometimes did on Sunday mornings, about nothing in particular, or perhaps about everything in general, the way the mind moves when it is not tasked with a specific problem. I was thinking about the school and the summer's flood that had, in the end, cost less than expected and been recovered from better than anticipated, and about James's latest letter and the hydraulic system he was designing, and about the tenants and the accounts and the east wall and what winter was likely to bring. Cecily came and stood beside me. She did not say anything. She looked out over the park and the valley. We stood there for a while in the October morning, in the quiet. Then she said, "I was thinking." "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about the book," she said. "The drainage treatise, the one I was reading when you sat down at Hallerton House." "Yes. I've thought about it before," she said. "What would have happened if I'd been reading something else? Something that wasn't that book, that didn't catch your attention, that didn't give you something to ask me about? If I'd been reading a novel, or just sitting there with my hands in my lap like everyone expected me to, waiting? I thought about this. I would have walked the room and found nothing to stop me," I said honestly. I had been walking the room for an hour and found nothing to stop me. She was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm glad I took the book," she said. "So am I said. Another quiet. "Marcus," she said. "Yes. I'm glad it was you." I looked at her, at the view of the October estate, at the chalk stream in the valley, at 10 years and what they contained. And then at Cecily, who was looking at me with the same amber-brown eyes that had met mine across the table at Hallerton House, and had been meeting mine across tables and rooms and morning walks and winter storms ever since. "So am I said, "every day." The morning light moved on the park. The birds were in the elms at the far side. The chalk stream ran where we had put it, in the right channel, through the right ground. The estate was itself, well managed, well used, the kind of well that comes from care over time and not from luck. We stood in the October morning and looked out over it. And I was, in the 37th year of my life, and then in the 47th, and then in all the years between and after, not a man who had been right about most things, but who had been right about the one thing that mattered, which was where to sit down, and what to say next, and what kind of person was worth making an effort for. The answer was here. The answer had always been here. I should tell you about the year of the great dispute. It was the 5th year of our marriage, and the dispute was about the east boundary, and it was the kind of dispute that would have been, in the hands of other men with other wives, the source of an ongoing irritation for a decade and possibly a lawsuit at the end of it. In our hands it became something else, because Cecily was involved from the beginning, and because Cecily had what I had not, in 15 years of owning the estate before she came, developed to any useful degree. The patience to read all the documents and the instinct to find in them the thing that actually mattered. The east boundary of the Varnholt estate had been disputed, in a quiet, intermittent way, for the better part of 30 years. The dispute was with the Aldenton estate, a neighboring property of similar size, owned at the time by an elderly baronet named Sir Charles Aldenton, who had inherited it from his uncle, and who had spent the subsequent 20 years managing it through a series of factors whose principal talent appeared to be spending money without materially improving what they spent it on. The boundary question had been raised twice in my father's time and once in mine, and it had never been formally resolved, because it was easier to leave it as a productive ambiguity than to force it to a resolution that would require one party to concede something. The ambiguity became less productive in the 5th year because Sir Charles Aldenton died, and his property passed to his nephew, a man named Percival Aldenton, who was 30, ambitious, and in the possession of a new solicitor who had formed the view that the east boundary, if correctly established, would give the Aldenton estate a strip of Varnholt land roughly half a mile long and 30 yards wide, which included part of the chalk stream and the access road to the East Mill. This view was communicated to us by Harwick on a Thursday morning in March, with the additional intelligence that the new solicitor had already begun surveying. I was prepared to engage a solicitor of my own and to argue the boundary in the conventional way, which would have taken between 2 and 5 years and cost both parties considerably. Cecily said, "May I look at the documents?" I gave her the documents. They filled a trunk, most of which was correspondence and draft agreements from the previous century, organized with the systematic randomness of generations of solicitors who had each believed their predecessor's filing system was inadequate and had invented their own. She read them over 5 days. On the morning of the 6th day, she came to my study with the key document in her hand, a survey map from 1743, which had been folded inside a later survey from 1801, which had been placed in a folder with the heading Miscellaneous, Resolved, and which she had found because she read everything including the folders with headings that suggested their contents were not worth reading. "Look at this," she said. I looked. The 1743 survey map showed the east boundary at a position that was approximately 15 yards west of where the Aldenton solicitor's survey had placed it. More importantly, it showed a feature at the boundary that appeared in neither later survey, a boundary stone placed at the specific point where the stream crossed the boundary line. The stone was described in the survey notes as bearing an inscription. "The stone could still be there," Cecily said. "It could," I said. "If the stone is there," she said, "and if it bears the inscription, then the 1743 survey is confirmed, and the boundary is the 1743 boundary, which is 15 yards west of where Aldenton's solicitor has placed it." I looked at the map. The stone would be under 10 inches of alluvial deposit if it's been there since 1743. Yes, she said, we should probably go and dig. We went and dug. It is not, in retrospect, the most dignified thing I have done on my own land, but Harwick supervised, and the two groundsmen did the actual digging, and Cecily directed the location with the precision of a woman who has read a survey map with full attention, which she had. And after 40 minutes and approximately 2 feet of carefully removed clay and chalk, and the debris of a century and a half, the iron spade in the second groundsman's hand struck something solid, and we found the boundary stone. It bore the inscription. It was the 1743 boundary stone, placed exactly where the map said it should be, confirming the position of the east boundary and making the Aldenton solicitor's survey incorrect by definition. The dispute was resolved within a month without litigation, because the Aldenton solicitor was a precise man who understood the implications of the stone, and who had not been prepared for the possibility that someone would actually dig for it. Harwick, examining the stone in the afternoon light with an expression of deep satisfaction, said, "In 30 years on this estate, nobody thought to dig." "Lady Varnholt thought to dig," I said. "Yes," Harwick said, "she did." Cecily was already walking back toward the house, making notes. I would tell you also about the question of the mill lease, which arose in the 4th year and which was resolved by Cecily in a single conversation that would have taken me 3 letters and 2 meetings, and about the matter of the disputed tithe in the 7th year, which she addressed by producing a letter from my great-grandmother's correspondence that no one had read in 60 years, and which settled the matter with a completeness that left the opposing party no reasonable avenue of objection. And about the tenant committee that she organized in the 8th year, which was the first formal meeting between the estate management and the tenant families since anyone could remember, and which produced, in its first session, 3 improvements to the cottage maintenance schedule that Harwick subsequently described as the most sensible changes he had seen in 20 years. These things are not the dramatic episodes of a life. They are not the campaigns or the dispatches or the bridge. They are the actual substance of what I have lived in for the better part of 10 years. The practical, daily, careful management of a life and an estate and a set of relationships with people whose welfare depended in part on whether we were paying attention. Cecily was always paying attention. I have come to believe that this is rarer than it sounds. It is very easy to be broadly attentive, to have a general concern for the welfare of others, to intend well, to be ready to respond in a crisis. What is harder, and what I have watched Cecily do steadily for 10 years, is the specific, sustained, detailed attention to the actual condition of specific people and specific problems, without generalizing them into categories or managing them from a distance. Mrs. Crane in the West Cottage was not a tenant family in difficulty. She was Mrs. Crane, with 3 children and a 4th on the way, and the specific difficulty was the rent in a specific month, and the specific solution was a specific conversation and a specific arrangement. The map of tenant welfare was not a summary. It was 42 names. I learned this from her. Or rather, I already knew it, in the way of having always known it from the campaign, where the cost of losing track of specific people was always visible immediately. But I had allowed myself, in the peacetime estate years before Cecily, to let it become abstract again, the way things do when there is no immediate cost to abstraction. She made it specific again. She named the names. She knew the names. She used them. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. I told her this once, that she had changed the way I managed the estate. I said it badly because I always said these things badly, but she understood what I meant because she always understood what I meant. She said, "You were already paying attention. You just needed someone to organize it." "That's a kind way of describing it," I said. "It's an accurate way," she said. "You notice things, you always have. You let the system handle them because you didn't have a system for the kind of things that aren't in the accounts." "Now I have a system," I said. "Now you have me," she said, "which amounts to the same thing." I considered arguing the point. I did not, because she was right, and because arguing with Cecily when she was right was an exercise I had learned to reserve for the occasions when it mattered. In the 4th year of the school, we had our first girl who arrived not recommended, but who found her way there on her own initiative. Her name was Frances Mott. She was 19, the daughter of a glassblower in the county town. Not a gentleman's daughter, not from any family that would typically have been connected to Marn House. She appeared at the school door on a Tuesday morning in November with a letter she had written herself, addressed to Cecily, in which she explained that she had heard about the school from a woman in the market who had a sister who had attended, and that she had no money for fees and no family recommendation, but that she had taught herself to read from her brother's school books and had been doing the accounts for her father's business since she was 14, and that she wanted to learn mathematics. Cecily read the letter at the school and then, that evening, told me about it. I admitted her, she said. On her own terms, she's working in the school kitchen 2 mornings a week in exchange for the tuition. She's also teaching the younger girls a method of mental arithmetic she worked out herself that is better than the one I've been using. I thought about this. She found a better method, I said. She did, Cecily said. She's 19 and she's never had a lesson in formal mathematics, and she found a more efficient method than the one in the standard textbook, working from observation of how figures actually behave in accounting practice. What are you going to do with her? I asked. Cecily looked at me with the particular expression she used for questions that she considered somewhat obvious. I'm going to teach her everything I can, she said. And then I'm going to find her a position where her mind can do what it's capable of. Frances Mott was at Marn House for 2 years. She left with a thorough grounding in mathematics, natural philosophy, French, and estate accounting, and with a reference from Cecily that described her as the most naturally gifted student of figures the school had produced. She obtained a position with a trading firm in the county town, where she became, within 3 years, the person who managed the firm's books, and whose method of mental arithmetic had been adopted, by the 10th year, by the other 3 members of the firm's accounting staff. She wrote to Cecily each year. Cecily kept the letters. I read them sometimes in the years after, when I came across them in the library. They were the letters of a woman who knew she had been given something and who had not forgotten it, and who was, in the way she worked and the way she spoke of her work, repaying it forward in every direction she could reach. This was what the school was doing, not in the grand summary of an institution, but in Frances Mott's letter in November, and Mary Trevelyan's position in the North, and Patience Alcott managing the Countess's estate with the competence of a woman who had been taught to think clearly and speak plainly and know her subject. In the summer of the 9th year, James and Harriet had their first child, a girl born in August named after Cecily's mother. James wrote to us within the hour, a letter that was slightly illegible in the good way of letters written by men in the immediate aftermath of something enormous, and which I read twice and then handed to Cecily, who read it once and then sat very quietly for a moment with it in her hands. He's all right, I said. Yes, she said. Harriet's well. Yes, she looked at the letter. He said she's small, she said. The baby, he said she's very small. They usually are, I said. I know, she folded the letter. I was thinking about my mother would have, she stopped, started again quietly. She would have been very glad about this. I looked at her. She was a good person, Cecily said. Very practical, very kind, the way of people who don't have the luxury of being impractical. She died when I had just turned 20. I'd had 2 years at home after school, and she'd spent some of those years worrying about James and worrying about my father's business, and then she died, and then my father's business failed, and then I was at Hallerton House. She paused. I don't think about her as much as I used to. Which is either a sign that time passes or a sign that things have been good enough that the grief receded. She looked at me. I think it's both. It can be both, I said. Yes, a long pause. She would have liked you, she said. She had no patience for men who talked more than they thought. She would have liked that you think before you talk. Most people find it standoffish, I said. Most people prefer the performance, Cecily said. She didn't, a pause, I don't. We went to see James and Harriet and the baby in September, when the harvest accounts were settled, and Harwick had the estate in hand. The baby had the amber eyes. Cecily held her in the afternoon light of Harriet's drawing room and said nothing for a long time, just looked, and the expression on her face was one I had not seen before, entirely open, entirely present, the look of a person who is receiving something directly and without any armor between them and it. James was watching his sister with the expression of a man who is very glad of something and also very moved by it. And when I met his eyes across the room, he gave me the nod of a man who understands what he is looking at and is grateful for it. We went home in the early evening, in the autumn light. Cecily was quiet in the carriage for a long time. Then she said, "I want to make sure the school has a proper endowment, not dependent on our annual contribution. Something settled so it continues regardless." I said, "I'll speak to the solicitors." "And I want to write a proper guide," she said. "The Thursday program guide was 7 pages. I want to write something more complete. The whole curriculum, the method, the approach, so someone else can do it if," she paused. "So it continues." "It will continue," I said. "I know," she said. "I want to make sure of it." We made sure of it. The endowment was established in the spring of the 10th year. The guide was written over the winter, not 7 pages, but 62. The most thorough document I had read in years, clear and precise, and organized with the care of a person who knows that the person reading it will need to be able to act on it without further instruction. I read every draft, not because she needed me to, she knew what she was doing, but because I found it each time one of the most interesting things I had read in a long time. It was the mind I had first encountered in the argument about drainage systems, applied now to the question of how to educate women who had been overlooked and underestimated and given no tools. And the answer was, as all of Cecily's answers were, precise and practical and based on the actual problem rather than the general notion of the problem. She finished the final draft in February of the 10th year, in the library, at the table where we had sat across from each other on the morning of the 3-month conversation, and she had said yes. She put down the pen, she looked at the stack of pages. "That's done," she said. "It's very good," I said. She looked at me. "You've read all of it." "Twice," I said. "The section on mathematics teaching is the best thing I've read on the subject." "You read things on the subject of mathematics teaching." "I read what you write," I said, "on any subject." She looked at me for a moment. "You're a peculiar man," she said. "Frequently told," I said. "It's not a criticism," she said. "I've been meaning to be clear about that. When I say you're peculiar, I mean you're unlike what I expected. From any man, but particularly from a man with your reputation and your history and your particular quality of taking up a great deal of room when you walk into a room." "I take up a great deal of room when I walk into rooms." "You do," she said. "But here in the library with me, you're present, but you don't push. You're very large and very still and very attentive, and it has taken me approximately 9 years and 11 months to get entirely used to it. But I have now, and I want to tell you that it is one of the things I value most about being in a room with you." I looked at her across the table. 9 years and 11 months, I said. "Approximately," she said. "We will have been married 10 years and 5 weeks, I said. "Yes," she said. "I know," a pause. "I've been thinking about that. And I've been trying to work out what I want to say," she said, "which is unusual for me because I don't usually have difficulty saying what I think." "You're not having difficulty now," I said. "No," she agreed. "I'm saying it now." "Which is that," she looked at the completed guide on the table, and at the library, and at the window where the February light was coming through pale and clean, and then at me. 10 years ago I was reading a book in a chair at the far end of a room, and I was doing it because it was the only thing in the room that interested me, and because I had decided that if I was going to be sold at a market, I was at least going to use the time usefully. And a man sat down beside me and asked me about drainage, and I thought at the time that it was probably a tactic and that I should be careful, and I was careful for quite a long time afterward. She paused. But it wasn't a tactic. And I don't know if you knew that at the time or discovered it afterward, but it mattered. That it wasn't a tactic. It wasn't a tactic, I said. I genuinely wanted to know about the drainage. I know that now, she said. I knew it actually fairly quickly. You were too interested to be tactical. Tactics look a certain way and interest looks a different way, and you were interested. In the drainage, and then in what I thought about the poor relief pamphlet, and then in what I thought about James's school, and then in what I thought about, she stopped. In what I thought, that was what it was. You wanted to know what I thought. I still do, I said. I know, she said. You've made that very clear for 10 years. A pause. I want to tell you something. I want to tell you that it has not been a managed arrangement for me for a very long time. I don't know if I've said that clearly enough in the years since I said it the first time. You've said it, I said. But I want to say it more specifically, she said. I want to say that the thing I am most grateful for in the 10 years is not the school, or the estate, or James's education, or the chalk stream boundary, or any of the practical things. The thing I am most grateful for is that I have been in a room for 10 years with a person who took me seriously, who thought that what I thought was worth knowing, who argued with me when I was wrong and agreed with me when I was right, and always assumed that I was capable of being either, rather than assuming in advance which one I was. She met my eyes. That is the thing. That is what 10 years of it feels like, from where I am. I looked at her. I looked at her for a long moment, in the February library, with the guide to the school in a neat stack on the table between us and the window pale with winter light. "Cecily," I said. "Yes." "That is all I have ever wanted to do," I said. "Since Hallerton House, simply take you seriously. It has not been an effort, it has been the easiest thing." She looked at me. "That is possibly the finest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "It's the truth," I said. "I know," she said. "That's why it's fine." We sat in the February library, and the winter light moved across the floor, and the estate was quiet around us in the way it always was. And I felt, as I always did in these moments, the large and steady warmth of the thing I had found and kept, and which had found and kept me in return. The 10th year came. The October morning, the chalk stream. The years of it laid out behind us like a well-managed estate, not perfect, not without the difficulty and the flood and the disputed boundary and the cold November winds and the things that come with any life genuinely lived, but sound. Fundamentally sound. Built on the right ground and draining correctly and carrying more than it had at the beginning. That is what 10 years of the right thing looks like. That is what it is to sit down in the right chair and say the right first thing and then to keep going, one conversation at a time, one boundary stone at a time, one Thursday lunch at a time, one letter from Francis Mott at a time, until you look back over your shoulder and find that you have, without intending to in the sense of planning it all out at the beginning, built something that is worth building. I did not plan it. I sat down beside a woman who was reading about drainage systems, and I asked her what she thought, and she told me, and she has been telling me ever since, and I have been listening. And between the telling and the listening, we have made the thing you have just heard about. Which is to say, a life. Simply that. A life. I was not a sentimental man. But I know what a good life looks like. And I know where mine began. I have been telling this in the large strokes, and I want to go back and fill in some of the smaller ones, because it is in the smaller ones that the actual texture of it lives. The first summer was not entirely easy. I have described it as a time of settling in, of the drainage project and the evening's reading and the pattern finding its shape, and all of that is true. But there were also the days when the pattern had not yet set, when we were two people who had made a decision based on limited information, and were still in the process of finding out what that decision actually contained. Cecily was not a woman who showed difficulty easily. I understood this within the first month, not because she was cold or performed ease she didn't feel, but because she had spent the years before Varnholt House in circumstances that required the management of difficulty without anyone to share the management with, and she had developed, as a result, a set of habits that kept most of her interior process internal. She processed things and emerged on the other side with a conclusion. What happened in the processing was not, as a rule, visible. I noticed this and found it at times a challenge. There was an evening in early April of the first year when I came to dinner and found her already seated, with the particular quality of stillness that I was beginning to learn was different from her ordinary quiet, a stillness that had a sound underneath it, like a held breath. I sat down, we ate the first course. She said very little, which was not itself unusual, but the quality of the silence was different from the comfortable kind. At the end of the second course I said, "Tell me what you're thinking." She looked at me. "I received a letter today," she said, "from the solicitor managing my father's estate. The final matters are resolved. The last of the property, a piece of furniture that had been in storage, has been sold." She paused. "It's done. There's nothing left." I looked at her. "My father's life," she said very quietly. "His whole life, the house, the books, the furniture, the business, all of it managed down to nothing and sold. And now it's done." A pause. "I knew it was coming. I've known for months. I just didn't." She stopped. "I didn't know it would feel like that." Like what? I asked. Like a door closing, she said. Not a good door, but a door. She looked at her hands. I know it's better that the debts are resolved. I know it's better that it's finished. He built all of that. He tried very hard for most of his life, and it came to nothing at the end, and now it's gone and there's no trace. She met my eyes. I'm sorry, this is not. Don't apologize, I said. She stopped. You're allowed to grieve your father, I said. You're allowed to sit at this table in your own dining room and feel that a door has closed. You don't have to manage it out of sight. She looked at me for a long moment. I'm not used to not managing it out of sight, she said. I know, I said. You can practice. She was quiet again. Then after a moment, he wasn't a bad man. He was just not well suited to the management of money, and he loved my mother very much, and when she died he lost something that had been keeping him organized. She was the practical one. I didn't know that when she was alive, but I understood it afterward. She paused. He sold the books because he had to, and it broke his heart to do it, and I knew it did, and I couldn't stop it. And then he died. And then all of it was sold to pay what he'd borrowed to replace the income from the books. She paused again. The piece of furniture in storage was a clock, my grandfather's clock. I'd been hoping. She stopped. Did you want the clock? I asked. She looked at me. It was sold. Did you want it? She paused. Yes, but it doesn't matter. It matters, I said. Who has it? I don't know, she said. It went to a house sale. I made a note of the information, which she did not notice me doing, because she had looked away and was looking at something else. The window, or the past, or her father's study in a house that no longer existed. I made the note because I was the sort of man who, when told that something was lost, immediately began to think about whether it was actually irretrievable. I found the clock 3 weeks later. It had gone to a house in Dorchester, purchased by a merchant family who had since decided it did not suit the hall where they had placed it, and had moved it to the back passage. I bought it from them without difficulty, and without explaining why, which was easy enough when you were the kind of man who bought things without being questioned about motives. I had it cleaned and repaired and placed in the library at Varnholt, on the mantelpiece, on a Thursday afternoon in May while Cecily was at the school. She came home in the early evening. She walked into the library. She saw the clock. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went to it and put her hand on the case, which was a dark walnut with a particular carving on the hood that I had described to the house in Dorchester, and which had allowed them to identify it immediately. She stood there with her hand on the case for a long moment. Then she turned around. Her face was, I will try to describe it accurately, not composed, not the managed expression, the one underneath, open. How did you find it? She said. You told me it had gone to a house sale. I asked the solicitor which sale. And they told you. Eventually, I said, there were 3 letters involved. She looked at me. Marcus, she said. It belongs here, I said. You're here, it should be where you are. She crossed the room. She put her arms around me, which was not a thing she had done before. Not like that, not completely, not the way she did it then, which was entirely without the usual careful composure, just her arms around me and her face against my shoulder. I held her. We stood in the library in the May evening, with her grandfather's clock on the mantelpiece, and I held her until she was ready to step back, which was a while. When she did, she looked at me with the open face still. You wrote 3 letters, she said. And a 4th to the house in Dorchester, I said, to negotiate the price. You bargained for my grandfather's clock. I did not want to overpay, I said, out of principle. She looked at me for another moment. Then she made the sound I had learned to listen for the breath before the laugh. And she laughed, quietly in the May evening, and the open expression stayed. You are, she started. Ridiculous, I said. I know you've mentioned it. I was going to say unexpected, she said, but all right, both. We had dinner in the library that evening, because Mrs. Harwick had arranged it before I could tell her not to. And the clock ticked in the room, and we talked about the school and Harwick's report and a letter from James, and whether the Dorchester merchant had driven a hard enough bargain. And the evening was entirely ordinary, and also, in the way of the evenings I had come to need and was no longer embarrassed to need, exactly what it was. The clock is still on the library mantelpiece. I see it every day. I have seen it for 10 years. It will be there when I am not and when Cecily is not, and if we have built well when the people who come after us are not. It keeps time in the room where we have made most of our decisions, and it was kept through several hands and 3 letters, and a negotiation before it came there, which seems to me like the right amount of effort for a thing that belongs where it has ended up. Let me tell you about the question of the succession. It came up in the first year in the form of a letter from the solicitors, a careful letter, in the language of careful solicitors, noting that the matter of the heir was one that the estate's planning required attention to, and could I confirm whether Lady Varnholt was. I put the letter away and did not show it to Cecily, because it was the solicitor's business and not a thing I intended to be managed by correspondence. We spoke of it in the second year, directly and without the careful language, because Cecily was the kind of person who addressed things directly when they needed addressing. The solicitors will have written to you, she said, about the succession. They wrote to me in the first year, I said. I have not replied to that letter. She looked at me. Why not? Because it was a business letter, I said, about a matter that is not purely business, and I did not wish to give it the character of a business correspondence. She was quiet for a moment. I want to tell you something, she said. Tell me. I'm not certain, she said carefully. I don't know, that's the honest answer. I know what the estate requires, and I know what is expected, and I know that we have been married 2 years and that the question has been present in the background since the beginning. She paused. What I want to say is that I would rather we speak about it as what it actually is, which is a question about what we want, than as a question about what the estate requires. Then let's speak about it that way, I said. What do you want? She said. I thought about that question with the seriousness it deserved. I want what gives you what you want, I said. If you want children, I want children. If you don't, I want to work out what we do about the solicitor's concern, which is a genuine concern, and which we should address one way or another, but not as the primary driver of a decision that has other dimensions. She looked at me for a long time. You are the most straightforwardly decent man, she said, that I have encountered in my life. I have had it described less positively, I said. Not by anyone whose description I would trust, she said. We talked for another hour. At the end of it, we had not resolved the question, because it was not a question that resolved in a single conversation, and we both knew that. But we had agreed on the shape of it, which was that it was our question and not the solicitor's question, and that we would approach it that way. In the 4th year, Cecily told me on a Wednesday morning in October that she thought we should speak to the estate physician. I said I would make the appointment. She looked at me. Do you know what I mean? Yes, I said. You're not, she paused. You don't have to perform equanimity about this if you don't feel it. I feel equanimity, I said. Genuinely. Because the relevant thing is you, and the relevant question is what is good for you, and I intend to listen to whatever the physician says without deciding in advance what I would prefer it to say. She looked at me for a moment. All right, she said. The physician said what physicians say in such cases. That there were reasons, and that they were reasons, and that some could be addressed and some could not, and that these things were not straightforward. We addressed what could be addressed, and in the 5th year Cecily told me, on an October morning of very similar weather to the first October morning, in the library where we did our most important talking, that she was expecting a child. I will not, because this account is already long, and because I am not the most eloquent man on earth, attempt to describe what that felt like. I will say that it felt large and still and important in a way that was different from the importance of decisions in the field, because field decisions are made in urgency, in the press of circumstances, and this was a thing that was simply happening quietly in the October library with the clock ticking and the window pale with morning light. Are you all right? I asked. I'm frightened, she said with her characteristic honesty, and very glad. Both things at once, I said. Yes, she said. Our daughter was born in the spring of the 6th year, on a March morning when the chalk stream was running fast with the last of the winter rains, and the park had the first green of the new season, and the east wing ceiling, the one that had come down in the storm of the first winter, had been solid and entirely sound for 4.5 years. We named her for Cecily's mother. She had the amber eyes. She had them from the beginning, those eyes that I had looked into across a table at Hallerton House and found, even then, very difficult to look away from. Edmund, who came the following week with Charlotte and Edward, stood in the doorway of the nursery and looked at the baby for a long moment, and then looked at me with an expression that was entirely Edmund. The expression of a man who has been right about something for a long time and is now being confirmed, and who has the grace not to say, "I told you so," because he doesn't need to. James came the following month with Harriet. He sat beside the baby for 20 minutes looking at her with the focused attention he brought to everything interesting, and then he looked up at Cecily and said with perfect seriousness, "She has your eyes." "I know," Cecily said. "She's going to be formidable," James said. "Probably," Cecily agreed. Mrs. Harwick, who had been present for the birth and had been in the house since before I inherited it, came to the nursery doorway on the second day, and stood there looking at the baby in Cecily's arms with an expression that I had never seen on her face before, which was not her household management expression, or her reporting expression, or her organizing expression, but simply the expression of a woman who was moved. "She's a proper Varnholt," she said, which was, for Mrs. Harwick, the highest compliment in the available range. The baby grew. She grew in the way of children who are both loved and given room, steadily, into her own shape, which was Cecily's mind and something else that might have been mine or might have been entirely her own. She walked the estate before she was 2, or rather was walked on it, in arms or later on sturdy small legs, and she had the amber eyes and Cecily's attention, and a determination about doors and staircases that required constant management, and that Harwick observed, on one occasion, was very like her mother. I watched her grow. I watched her the way I had watched the estate change under Cecily's attention, with the particular satisfaction of someone who can see the thing becoming what it is meant to be. I watched Cecily with her, in the evenings and the mornings and the school days and the Thursday lunches at Marne House, where the baby was eventually an additional presence in the courtyard, regarded by the older girls with a warmth, and by the youngest of the school's visiting children with the intense seriousness of small people assessing another small person. I watched Cecily hold her and read to her and answer her questions with the same precision and directness she brought to every question from any source, and I thought, not for the first time, that the person she was going to grow into would be worth knowing. And I thought about the book on drainage systems, about the chair at the far end of the room, about the 20 minutes of conversation that had turned into a carriage ride and a year of mornings, and a 3-month conversation, and 10 years and a school and a boundary stone dug up from the clay, and a clock found through 3 letters, and a man sitting beside his wife in a library in the October morning, while the world went on around them. One thing leads to another. That is the most basic truth I know. One question, do you have an opinion on tile drainage, leads to another question, and that one to another, and the questions accumulate into a conversation, and the conversations accumulate into a life, and the life accumulates into the thing you look back over from the south front on an October morning and find entirely itself, entirely sound, built on the right ground. The most important question I ever asked was about drainage. The most important answer I ever received confirmed what I already thought about my steward. These things seem written down like small things. They are not small things. I want to tell you about Harwick. He had been on the estate for 30 years when I inherited it, and he had managed it through my father's last illness, and the 2 years before I returned from the campaign with anything like full attention, and he had managed it well, which is to say he had kept it stable and solvent, and the tenants housed and fed, which is not as easy as it sounds in a long estate winter. He was a compact, weathered man of 60 when Cecily came, and he had seen everything the estate could produce by way of difficulty and weather and human foolishness, and he had very specific opinions about all of it. His opinion of Cecily in the beginning was watchful. Not hostile, Harwick was too practical for hostility, but reserved in the way of a man who has been managing something successfully and has no particular need for a new element to be introduced into the system. He answered her questions precisely, because she asked precise questions, and he followed her recommendations when she made them, after a period of assessment, because she was usually right, and he told me so with the particular economy of a man who gives no more acknowledgement than is due, and no less. What I did not expect was what happened in the 4th year. It was a Tuesday morning meeting, and Cecily was laying out the drainage plan for the South Field, which was the next drainage project after the Western pasture, and Harwick was listening with his usual attention, and at some point he said, "I've been thinking about the run from the east corner. The grade is too shallow for a straight tile run. We'd need to add a fall." Cecily looked at him. "I know," she said. "I was going to say the same thing. Do you want to calculate it, or should I?" Harwick looked at her for a moment. "I'll do it by noon," he said. "You can check my figures." This was not, in the abstract, a remarkable exchange. In the context of Harwick's 30 years as an estate factor, who had managed every previous drainage consultation by himself, or with the advice of the County Agricultural Society, it was, I thought, somewhat remarkable. After the meeting I said to him, "You asked her to check your figures." "Her eye is better than mine for the overall grade," he said, with the air of a man stating a fact rather than making a concession. "I know my figures are right. I want to know if the approach is right. She'll see it if it isn't." "Yes," I said, "she will." He went away to do his calculations. Cecily checked them at noon, found them correct, and added 2 observations about the east corner approach that Harwick incorporated into the final plan without comment, which was, from Harwick, the equivalent of a standing ovation. In the 8th year, Harwick had a bad winter, a chest illness that kept him confined to his cottage for 6 weeks, which had not happened in 32 years. His wife managed him through it with the determined efficiency of a woman who has been married to a stubborn man for many years and has developed accordingly. Cecily managed the estate decisions that would normally have fallen to Harwick in consultation with his 2 deputies, and also visited him twice a week with reports, which was not strictly necessary, but which was the kind of thing she did. He told me in the spring, when he was recovered, she didn't change anything that didn't need changing. "No," I said. "She kept the tenants informed. Every decision that affected them, she told them directly, not through the deputies, herself." "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "In 30 years," he said, "I have managed this estate for your father and for you. I managed it for your father because he was a good man who deserved to have it managed well, and I managed it for you for the same reason." He paused. "I manage it for you now because you deserve it, and because—" He paused again in the particular way of a man who is about to say something he has not said before. "Because she is here," he said. "And the estate deserves what she brings to it, and I want to make sure she has it at its best." I looked at him. "She'd be embarrassed if I said that to her," he said. "She would," I agreed. "But I'm saying it to you," he said, "so you know." "I know. I have known since the morning she walked the western boundary in a plain dark coat and diagnosed the drainage problem correctly, and said my steward was probably right. And he was, and she was, and it has been true in some version or another every morning since." Harwick retired in the end in the 10th year, not entirely, because he was constitutionally incapable of entire retirement, but from the formal role of estate factor, which passed to his deputy, a man named Groves who had worked alongside him for 12 years, and who had, in those 12 years, received a thorough education in both the technical and the human dimensions of estate management, the latter significantly informed by watching Cecily. He attended the anniversary gathering that we held in October, not a large gathering, just the people who had been there since the beginning. Edmund and Charlotte and Edward, James and Harriet, Lady Fenwick, Mrs. Harwick, the 2 groundsmen who had dug up the boundary stone, Francis Mott, who had come back to see the school. We stood in the drawing room in the October evening, and I looked around at the people in it, and felt the weight of the 10 years in a way that was not heavy but full, the particular fullness of a decade that has been lived in rather than managed through. Cecily was talking to Francis Mott, who was telling her something with the focused energy of a woman reporting important news. James was showing Edward something in a notebook, engineering plans, almost certainly. Lady Fenwick was speaking to Charlotte with the bright, precise attention that was her characteristic approach to anyone she found worth talking to. Edmund was watching me watch all of this, with the expression of a man who has waited a very long time to see his brother look like this, and who is finding the experience satisfying. I went to Edmund. "Don't say it," I said. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You were about to say that you told me so," I said. "I wasn't," he said. "I was going to say that you look like a man who has no idea what to do with how happy he is, and that I find this extremely gratifying." "I find it gratifying too," I said. "Yes," Edmund said, I can see that. Across the room, Cecily looked up from her conversation with Francis Mott and met my eyes. The look she gave me was the warm one, the open one, the one that had started in the winter of the first year, and that had been the most reliable constant of the decade since. I held it for a moment. Then I went to her. This is where I have arrived at the end of this account. Not at a grand conclusion, not at the summary of a campaign. I have told you the campaign, and it ended the way campaigns do, with a result and a cost and the living going on afterward. This is where I have arrived, at a drawing room in October, with the people I have most reason to value in the world, and Cecily Marne beside me. Who is Cecily Varnholt now? Who has been Cecily Varnholt for 10 years, and who was always, I believe this, and have believed it since I understood enough about her to believe anything, exactly the person she was going to be, regardless of the name she carried. She would have been this person in the gray gown with the drainage book. She was this person in the plain dark coat on the western boundary. She is this person in the October drawing room in my mother's pearls with her daughter on her arm and her eyes on mine. The name she carries is mine. The person she is her own. I know the difference. I have always known the difference. That is, perhaps, the most important thing I have ever understood. She turned to me in the October drawing room and said quietly, so only I could hear, 10 years. Yes, I said. Are you glad? Every day, I said. You know that. I know that, she agreed, but I wanted to hear it today. Every day, I said again. Every morning at the table and every Tuesday meeting and every November storm and every letter from James and every Thursday in the courtyard at the school. Every morning, without exception. She looked at me with the amber-brown eyes that had not changed. Then so am I, she said. The October evening continued around us, warm and full. The clock ticked on the mantelpiece in the library, where we would sit later, in the familiar chairs, in the familiar comfortable silence of two people who have nothing to perform, and nothing to manage, and everything to say. I was the Ward Duke of Varnholt. I was a man who burned a bridge and did not sleep easily and argued about drainage and found, in the far end of a room on a Tuesday morning, the thing he had not known he was looking for. I am the man who sat down beside her. That is, in the end, the account of my life that matters. The rest is prologue. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and then I am done. It concerns the matter of reputation. I am a man with a reputation. That reputation, the Ward Duke, the most feared man in 3 counties, the man who burned the bridge, has followed me through 37 years and beyond. It preceded me into Hallerton House. It preceded me into every room I have walked into since. I have never actively managed that reputation. I have not tried to soften it or to correct it or to replace it with a different one. A reputation, I have always believed, is a record of what you have actually done. And if the record says that you made hard decisions in difficult conditions and did not flinch from them and carried what they cost, then that is a fair record, and it is not mine to revise. What I did not expect in the years of Cecily was how much the reputation would change around me without my changing it. Not in the formal sense. The dispatches still say what they say. The military history still records the bridge and the retreat and the outcome. The county still knows that I am a man who does not give way when pushed, and that my handshake is worth the value of a signed contract, and that I am not a man to cross lightly. All of that is the same. But the thing that the school does to a reputation is interesting. People who know that the Ward Duke of Varnholt endowed a school for women of limited means. People who know about the Thursday lunches and the 62-page guide and Francis Mott and Patience Alcott and Mary Trevelyan. Those people look at the reputation with a different set of tools. They look at the bridge and the retreat and the hard decisions, and they see a man who makes hard decisions when they are necessary, and then in the peacetime after, puts the same decisiveness in service of a different kind of work. Not softer, different. Lady Fenwick said something to me, at the 7th-year gathering, that I have thought about many times. She said, "You know what the school says about you." I said I didn't, but I was interested. It says that you understood when a woman with real capacity asked for room to use it, what the correct answer was, she said. That's what it says about you, and in my experience that is rarer than wars. I thought about that for a long time. It is rarer than wars. The decision to be in a war is, in the end, made by a small number of powerful men in rooms, and it is implemented by a large number of people who have very little say in it. The decision to give someone room, one specific person, one specific ask, one specific morning, is made one at a time by one person in the specific moment when the ask is made. I said yes to a woman reading about drainage systems. I said yes to her question about the boundary stone. I said yes to the school. These things were not large decisions, in the sense of the decisions that appear in dispatches. They were the decisions of a Tuesday morning, one at a time. They were the decisions of a life lived forward into the next thing, with attention. They added up. They have added up to this. The estate at Varnholt in the 10th year carries 3 times the livestock it carried 15 years ago. The chalk stream runs in its proper channel. The drainage works hold in wet springs. The east boundary is settled and documented and marked with a stone that we dug up ourselves. The tenant map is maintained and current. The school at Hallerton has 64 students and a waiting list and a 62-page guide and an endowment that will fund it past the lives of the people who built it. Harwick has retired. Groves manages the estate with the precision of a man trained by the best. Mrs. Harwick still comes in on Mondays to consult with the new housekeeper because she likes to and because she knows things that take 30 years to know. James is 30 and has a daughter with amber eyes and a hydraulic system that is, by his account, very nearly finished, which it has been for some months. Edmund is gray at the temples and entirely content, which is not a combination I ever expected from Edmund, but which suits him extremely well. Edward is 11 and has decided he is going to be an engineer or an architect, and is currently arguing with James about the relative merits of these professions, which James is treating with great seriousness, and Charlotte is treating with great amusement. Our daughter is 4 and is formidable, which is exactly what James predicted. Cecily is 43 and is exactly who she was at 23, in the chair at the far end of the room, with the book and the amber eyes and the quality of complete and absolute precision of mind that makes every room she is in more honest than it would otherwise be. I am 47 and I am not what I was. Not the man who burned the bridge and did not speak of it and managed his difficulty in the dark, and sat in the chair by the fire at 1 in the morning with his boots on while the north wind made its sound. I am still that man. I carry what I carry, but I carry it differently. I carry it with company, which I did not have before and did not know how to want, and the difference between carrying a thing alone and carrying it with company is the difference between a load and a shared weight, and I know now which I prefer. I prefer this. I will always prefer this. The morning of the 10th anniversary, standing on the south front in the October light, Cecily said what she said, and I said what I said, and we went inside. We had breakfast in the breakfast room, as we usually did, and Cecily told me about a letter she had received from Francis Mott, who had been promoted to head the accounts department of the trading firm, and we talked about that, and about whether the Crane girl would apply to the school for the following year, and about a problem with the mill that Groves had flagged in his Monday report, and about what the winter looked like from the barometer's point of view. These were the ordinary things. These were what 10 years of the right choice looked like from the inside. Not the dramatic claiming, not the claiming before the shocked society. I did that once in the hall at Hallerton House, and it was correct, and it was the beginning, and it mattered. But the substance of it, the meat and bone of a decade, is breakfast, and the mill report and Francis Mott's promotion, and the barometer, and whether the Crane girl should apply for the autumn term. The substance is this. The ordinary, specific, daily substance of 2 people taking each other seriously across a table every morning for 10 years. That is the story. That is the whole of it. I sat down beside a woman reading about drainage systems, and I asked her what she thought, and she told me. And we have been talking in one room or another ever since. And I am glad. Every day, without exception, I am glad.